Inferno. If a true hell existed, then that place was certainly it. A knight who had protected his king until the very end lay on the ground, pierced by several arrows. Even as he was dying, he still told His Highness Baron that this was all he could do. It was the last repayment he could offer. But Baron ordered Kiri to get up. The knight simply handed over his sword, asking him to raise it one more time, because he could not stop there. So Baron took the sword and charged madly across the battlefield. After all, the war was not yet over. Kyrus, a nation created by dragons and humans, had demanded the national treasure of his homeland, Secretia. They wanted the axis of time, but the request was refused. And that was exactly why that war began. It became the last war in Secretia's history. Even after losing one of his arms, Baron Secretia, the king of Secretia, continued pressing forward with his sword. As several battle mages hurled fire spells at him, Baron could already feel that he was on the brink of death. He knew it was too late, but he could not let that stop him. Not after everything that had happened. After all, he was the sword of Secretia. Then he split an enormous fireball in two with his sword. Standing before him were the Valken, Kyrus's order of mages, and behind them stood the man responsible for turning his homeland into that hell, the Mad King Planchet. After the mages ceased their attacks, a man approached. He was a mage named Arson, commander of the Valken. He asked what Baron's name was, but the king replied that he had already forgotten everything. He said that now he was merely the sword that served that kingdom. The moment he tried to attack Arson, he was struck head-on by several ice crystals, and in that instant, Baron saw his entire life flash before his eyes. The fall of his homeland, the collapse of everything he loved, and then all the light disappeared. Later, he woke to find servants he had never seen before. A butler urged him to hurry, saying that Prince Planche had already departed. Upon hearing that name, Baron was struck with shock. He asked how that was possible, and why his arm was there, intact, if it had been torn off in the war. The butler found those words completely baffling, and asked if he had had a nightmare. After all, what did he mean by a severed arm? In that instant, Baron noticed something even worse. His arm was truly in its place. Moreover, memories that did not belong to him began flooding into his head. He asked the butler who he was. Who on earth had he become? The butler then replied that he was Callian Rain Karis, the third prince of Karis. It was in that moment that Baron understood he was living a nightmare, far more terrifying than he had imagined. Confused, he asked the current date. The butler replied that it was April 28th of the year 522. Then Callian grasped the truth. He was 10 years in the past, before the last war had begun. All of this had happened because of the axis of time. A mysterious object capable of turning back time had appeared suddenly in the royal palace of Secretia. The news spread quickly, and Karis, which ruled the continent, immediately began to covet the artifact. Secretia refused to hand over the axis of time, and Karis declared war as though they had been expecting that answer from the very beginning. In Baron's memory, his younger brother Chase had begged him not to leave for the war. Everyone who had gone had died. He did not want to lose the last member of the family as well. Then Callian realized something. In the original timeline, Chase had likely witnessed his death, and after that he must have used the axis of time to return to the past. That was the only possible explanation. His brother had given him one last chance to prevent the destruction of Secretia. The butler then said he understood that attending breakfast must be difficult, but they could not be late. Callian replied that he was on his way and apologized for the confusion. Inwardly, however, he had already made a decision. He would not waste this opportunity. This time, he would survive. Later, Callian, now occupying the body of the third prince, entered the dining hall. The butler apologized for the delay and mentioned that he had not expected the first prince to have arrived before him. This was Randel Sale Karis, the first prince. The three princes of Karis were half-brothers and descendants of the sacred bloodline of Tensel. By the king's order, they were all required to have breakfast together every morning. But according to Callian's memories, the third prince had always been treated as though he didn't exist. As he surveyed the hall, he noticed that one of his brothers was still missing, and just at that moment, the man appeared. Planche, the second prince. He entered with his shirt open and was clearly drunk. Callian felt irritated thinking that this man behaved that way even as royalty. And worse still, this was the same man who in the future would become the Mad King responsible for Secretia's destruction. From his relaxed and utterly disheveled appearance, it seemed he had already been unhinged long before the war began. From the body's memories, Callian knew that the first prince avoided confronting Planchet. After all, Karis's current queen was his biological mother. Within the royal palace, no one dared challenge his authority, least of all the third prince. Just thinking about how to survive in that place was already suffocating him. While sipping his tea in silence, Planche decided to provoke. He said he expected no decency from someone born of that woman. Even hearing that, Callian tried to restrain himself. He could not waste the chance Chase had given him, but the hatred still rose in his throat. He wanted to kill Planchet right then and there. Yet before anything could happen, Planchet himself slammed a teacup on the table and demanded to know how Callian dared look at him like that. At that moment, Randel intervened and said that was enough. Before leaving, Planche cast one last glance at Callian and said he had lost his appetite because of those disgusting red eyes. Afterward, Randel also stood and told Callian to behave, reminding him that the king's birthday was approaching, and this was not a good time to cause trouble. So Callian thought, irritated, that in the end they still found a way to blame him. Later, a servant named Yan was cleaning the tea that had spilled on Callian's shoes. As he watched, he realized that at least there was one person in that palace who was truly loyal to him. Even seeing daily exactly how horribly the third prince was treated, Yan still cared for him like a true servant. So Kalyan sincerely thanked him for his concern. This surprised Yan because the old prince would normally only complain and whine in situations like this. But now he was smiling. Upon receiving the memories of this body, Kalyan also learned about his lineage. He was a descendant of dragons. The first queen of Kairos had hair as black as night and eyes as red as sacred flames, and Kalyan was the only descendant to have inherited those traits. The problem was that his powers were considered a complete failure. Because of this, he always tried to hide his red eyes, and the main person responsible for that obsessive behavior was none other than Planche. Even so, Kalyan found it ridiculous. It was strange to feel as though he were watching someone else's memories, yet at the same time that body was now his. Then Yan commented that he seemed odd that day, and jokingly asked if the prince had read too many stories before bed. Kalyan replied that it was nothing, and that he was fine. Despite being a descendant of the Kairos royal family, he was still the son of a peasant concubine. The old Kalyan had lived in fear of everything, and had no one by his side except Yan. He was weak, insecure, and incapable of protecting himself. Then an important memory surfaced in Baron's mind. The true Kalyan died before even the coming-of-age ceremony. When he asked Yan for more details, he learned that only 4 months remained until the prince turned 15. According to the official story, Kalyan had attempted to poison the queen, failed, and then hanged himself out of fear of punishment, and that was how the people came to know of it all. Upon hearing this, he walked to the bedroom window while Yan watched with concern. Calculating the dates, he realized there were about 2 months left before the true prince's death. Since he still had no idea what had happened to Baron Secretia's original body, he could not simply sit around waiting for death to come, but rather than doing something drastic, he simply asked Yan for a pair of scissors and cut the fringe that hid his red eyes. Yan was startled and asked what he was doing. He said that Planche would hate it, but Kalyan replied that he could not keep living like a fool just because that man hated him. He no longer cared about that. This time, he was going to take control of his own life. And as expected, the moment Planche saw Kalyan like that for the first time, he immediately called him an idiot. Then he sat at the table remarking that those eyes looked like tomatoes. But Kalyan calmly replied that he had a name. His name was Kalyan. Planche gave a mocking smile and said of course, he should address him by name, but in the very next instant, he picked up a knife and hurled it, not toward Kalyan, but toward Yan. Before the knife could reach the servant, Kalyan himself caught the blade mid-air. His hand was cut immediately and began to bleed. Then Planche feigned surprise and commented that his hand had slipped. He then asked, with heavy irony, whether Kalyan was hurt. Even while bleeding, the third prince simply placed the knife back beside Planche's plate and replied that he was fine, especially considering that supposed accident. Later, Yan was bandaging his hand while insisting they should call a physician, but Kalyan said it was just a small cut. Then he asked why Yan hadn't dodged the knife, since it was obvious the attack was meant for him. Yan replied that if he had dodged, Planche would likely have used that as an excuse to hurt the prince even more. Upon hearing that, Kalyan thanked him sincerely. He then mentioned that the moment he cut his hand, he felt his heart race in a strange way, so he said he was going to wash his face and told Yan not to let anyone in. He also forbade calling a physician. Alone, Kalyan began to think about what had happened earlier. The instant he tried to use aura to defend himself from Planche's attack, he felt a tremendous pain in his chest, so he decided to reproduce that situation to understand the state of this body. When he concentrated his aura, he noticed something unexpected. Near his heart, there were 3 mana circles. It was then that he understood the truth. All this time, Kalyan had not been a knight of aura. He was a mage. 3 days later, Yan remarked that the wound on his hand had barely improved and insisted once again that they call a physician. But Kalyan was more interested in something else. The royal tailor, Seton Slake, had arrived. The moment the tailor saw the prince, he was visibly surprised by his appearance and immediately apologized for his reaction. But Kalyan was already tired of that. Since cutting his hair, everyone had reacted the same way. The old Kalyan, who had suffered his entire life for resembling a mother he never got to know, had come to despise his own red eyes, so much so that he had removed all the mirrors from his room. So he simply told the tailor that it was fine. He said he already knew he resembled Freya, and told him to just do his job. The tailor quickly replied that he would begin taking measurements. While doing so, he commented worriedly that the prince needed to eat more because he was far too thin. When Kalyan looked at his own reflection in the mirror, he realized he truly did look weak. The royal family of Kairos was known as descendants of dragons, but the truth was even more complex. They were descended from 2 of the 8 heroes who had sealed the evil god, Rashara and Sisphania. It was Sisphania who gave rise to Karius's royal bloodline, passing on the power of healing and the magical talent known as the Blessing of Sisphania. Because of this, Kalyan's wound should have fully healed a long time ago, but it had not. And worse still, every time he used mana, he felt an intense pain in his heart. That was extremely dangerous. In that state, he might not be able to use either aura or magic, and if it continued, he could die at any moment. While he was thinking about this, the tailor showed him some new clothes, saying they would be perfect for the king's birthday. Then Kalyan remembered something important. The great mage Ellen Manaseal would also be present. He needed to meet that man. Ellen was considered an idol among mages, and one of the few 7th Circle users on the entire continent. In the past, he had been invited to attend the king's birthday celebration and visit Kairos, but because of a certain incident, he had ended up being turned away at the kingdom's gates. The story had spread even as far as Secretia, and 10 years later, later, Ellen reached the 8th circle, becoming the only mage at that level on the entire continent, and Callian knew very well that no one understood mana better than him. If anyone could resolve the problem with his body, it was Ellen Manassil. The problem was that he did not know what incident had driven the mage away from Karis, but one thing was obvious: that kingdom did not treat mages with respect. Watching the knights training from the window, Callian also noticed something else. The enormous military power of Karis existed because of the influence of Planche's maternal family, the Breezen family. That was why he needed the support of mages. Even if just a little, he needed enough power to protect himself from the Breezens. And if he could bring Ellen to his side, perhaps he would be able to prevent the war that Planche would start in the future. But before any of that, he needed to resolve a far more immediate problem. The tailor and the servants were choosing absolutely terrible clothes for him to wear. So Callian sighed and asked, for the love of everything, that they stop putting ribbons and ruffles on his clothes. Later, while drinking tea alone, he realized he was already starting to grow accustomed to this new life. His hand was finally almost healed, and Planche had continued ignoring his existence, which honestly was wonderful. Then Jan appeared to inform him that he had riding lessons that morning, and that evening he was expected to dine with the Queen and Viscount Brisson, probably to discuss preparations for the king's birthday. And Callian thought, with some irritation, that one way or another, he still had to deal with those bothersome people. So he returned to his stamina and endurance training, something that left Jan a little worried. But in the prince's mind, it was nothing out of the ordinary, just a walk around the lake, so he told them not to worry so much. After all, what could possibly go wrong? Only later, while running, Callian was already nearly dying of exhaustion. Marilyn, who was accompanying him, asked if he was alright. She was his attendant and also the second daughter of the defense commander. According to her, on the first day he had managed 4.5 laps around the lake, on the second, only 4. And now, on the third day, he was still on the third lap and already looked completely spent. This made Callian uneasy. He began to wonder if he was really training correctly, because his energy seemed to be diminishing each time. Something was clearly wrong. Marilyn then asked why he didn't simply call a healer, if it was that difficult. But Callian replied that everything was fine. In truth, he could not let anyone examine him, because a healer might discover the existence of his mana circles. Not even Jan knew he was a mage and not a knight. If he acted carelessly, his life could end up in danger. So he simply told Marilyn he was fine, and that he would improve with time. Meanwhile, the noise coming from the knight's training ground caught his attention. Callian stood watching the sword strikes, the soldiers running and training relentlessly, and honestly, it looked very appealing to him, because it reminded him greatly of the old days. Marilyn explained that this was the training ground of the Knights of Pabel. Callian replied that he knew, and that he was only looking because he found it interesting. But she asked if he truly understood what the Pabel army represented. So the prince replied, not quite understanding the reason for the question, that they were the royal knights. But Marilyn clarified that, to be more precise, this was the army of knights belonging to the Brizon family, responsible for keeping the king's power in check. But someone overheard the whole conversation and decided to step in. It was none other than Commander Pabel himself. The moment he appeared, he said that if they had no business there, they had better leave. According to him, the knights were unsettled by the prince's gaze and could not train properly. Marilyn immediately demanded that he show more respect. After all, this was the third prince. But Commander Pabel asked, almost mockingly, if this was indeed Prince Callian. He said he had thought it was just a filthy rat trying to watch the training in secret. Callian felt irritated, but the one who truly exploded was Marilyn. She nearly lunged at the commander and looked ready to start a fight right then and there. But Pabel asked why she was shouting so much, when the prince himself had said nothing. It was in that moment that he noticed Callian's red eyes. The commander recalled that the prince had always been known as a timid, weak, and quiet little mouse. But that gaze was completely different, and it left him unsettled. Then Callian stepped forward and asked what exactly his duty as commander was. Some soldiers also drew closer to see what was happening, and were surprised to realize it was Prince Callian. Even so, no one showed fear or respect. Pabel himself noticed this. No one in that place respected the third prince. Even so, he replied that they were in the middle of training and therefore could not speak at that moment. He added that both of them were probably too busy anyway, but Callian did not let it pass, and repeated the question. What was his duty? Then the commander answered that his duty was to strengthen the forces of the royal family and protect both the royal family and the kingdom. Callian said that was exactly right. Then he snapped a branch off a tree and declared that the commander had failed in both duties. Pabel asked what he was talking about, completely bewildered. So the prince explained that, from everything he had observed, this training did not strengthen the royal family in any way whatsoever. In fact, it was dreadful. In the blink of an eye, Callian vanished from where he stood, leaving only a trail behind. By the time the commander realized what had happened, the prince was already behind him, striking with the branch. Pabel felt an immediate chill, certain he would die if he didn't block the blow. With no other choice, he drew his sword to defend himself. But the most absurd thing of all was that the branch did not break. And moments later, Callian even managed to disarm the commander, remarking that he couldn't believe he had failed to anticipate such a simple movement. It was disappointing. Then the prince addressed the second failure. The commander claimed to protect the royal family and the kingdom, yet he had just insulted a member of the royal family and drawn a sword against him. Could that not be considered treason? In that instant, Commander Pabel was completely shaken. He began to wonder if this was truly the same Prince Callian he had known. With no other choice, he dropped to his knees, pressed his forehead to the ground, ground and desperately begged for forgiveness. He said he had not been thinking clearly and implored for His Highness's pardon. The soldiers were completely stunned to witness that. As for Pavel, deep down, all he could think was that he had been humiliated by that wretched third prince, and he swore he would never forget it. Later, Yan was completely bewildered to see the prince return from endurance training, leading an enormous horse. Kalyan seemed extremely pleased as he stroked the black animal and announced that his name would be Raven. Yan, struggling to hold the reins, asked exactly where he had gotten this horse. Kalyan then explained that after everything settled between him and Commander Pavel, he had noticed a horse that no one could tame, not the commander, nor any other knight. The animal was fierce and wild in the extreme, so he had simply decided to bring the horse back with him. But Yan still asked whether that would truly cause no problems, because as far as he knew, that was not Prince Planche's horse. Kalyan replied that the soldier himself had said anyone could use that horse, so in his view, finders were keepers. Even so, he asked Marilyn to keep it quiet. But shortly afterward, he felt another sharp pain in his heart. It seemed he had pushed his body too hard again. Meanwhile, someone had been watching everything attentively. Every movement of Kalyan's, every shift in his behavior, and even the way he fought were all being analyzed. The mysterious messenger then returned to his true master and reported everything he had witnessed. After hearing the report, the man replied that even worms writhe when stepped on, but according to him, even if someone struggles, that doesn't change who they truly are. He then remarked that simply crushing that boy and killing him would be too dull. For now, it would be more interesting to simply observe. Later, during the dinner arranged with the princes, Kalyan felt a little uncomfortable having to face Planche again. He still wasn't used to the whole situation, but he noticed something strange. The prince seemed more dejected than irritating that evening. Perhaps it was because of the queen's and the viscount's delay. But before she even appeared, her presence could already be felt by the scent of flowers that filled the hall, and the moment he noticed it, Kalyan immediately recognized who was arriving. It was Celeste Brizin, the current queen of Karis. After the death of the previous queen, Celeste had used the power of the Brizin family to seize control of the royal knights. Most nobles supported her, and this caused the pitiful third prince Kalyan to become so insignificant that even a mere commander could treat him like garbage. That was why, in the eyes of many, he needed to be eliminated. The queen's attendant asked if they would really deal with Commander Pavel after what had happened. Celeste replied that they would, and said a suitable compensation would be arranged to resolve the matter, but she also made clear she did not wish to be troubled with such trivial affairs in the future. According to her, it wasn't worth wasting time on things so insignificant. She said this while looking directly at Kalyan. She then commented that he had grown considerably. Kalyan replied calmly that not by much, but that he would certainly grow a great deal more in the future. As he spoke, he kept his red eyes fixed on her. Then the Baron remarked that he had barely recognized the prince. Now, at last, he was showing his own face. He even said that he should have cut that hair sooner. This man was Renan Bresson, second son of Marcus Bresson. The queen was clearly displeased at the compliments directed at Kalyan, but she responded normally all the same. She then asked for the food to be served, saying she was hungry. Kalyan, taking in the whole scene, could only think that even the Viscount seemed slow-witted. Things in that palace truly were exactly as the rumor said. Shortly afterward, Celeste quietly approached her son. Concealing part of her face behind a fan, she asked about his horse. According to her, the animal no longer obeyed anyone. She then asked whether her son hadn't said he had completely lost control of that horse. The prince set down his cutlery and coldly replied that the horse had been useless from the start. After that, he simply rose and left the table. 3 weeks later, the annual celebration of the king's birthday took place, the most important event in the entire kingdom. Congratulatory delegations arrived from many places. The elves sent numerous luxurious gifts along with many other valuable items, and as expected, the princes were preparing extensively for the grand event. During the fitting, the tailor once again took Kalyan's measurements and asked if he was really eating properly. It was then that he noticed blood trickling from the prince's nose. Immediately, all the servants fell into a panic. Jan quickly ordered a cloth to be brought and for a physician to be called, but Kalyan replied that it was nothing serious and that he was fine. Even so, the tailor begged forgiveness for his boldness, but remarked that the prince had lost a great deal of weight. According to him, 3 weeks ago, Kalyan had not been this thin. The prince replied that he had perhaps just been exercising too much lately. He said he had been pushing himself quite hard in recent days, but in truth, he knew the situation was worse than it appeared. His energy was deteriorating more and more, and the pain when using mana continued to worsen. There was likely some serious problem with his heart. The tailor then said he should not treat the matter so lightly, and asked if he had seen a physician recently. Kalyan replied that there was no reason to get an examination, just because of a simple nosebleed. But Yan, trying to salvage the situation, suddenly blurted out that the prince had been picking his nose the day before. According to him, it must be a little difficult telling others about a habit like that. The servants stared at the prince in silence, trying to process the information. Then Yan confirmed everything with complete nonchalance. He said the prince had been exercising a lot and eating well, and that the bleeding was probably due to that. The tailor ended up accepting the explanation and replied that if that was the case, there was no problem. After all, no one knew the prince better than Yan. He even gave Kalyan a wink, proud of having resolved the situation. Kalyan's only thought was that the wretched man. In truth, Yan already knew everything. Kalyan had told him about being a mage, and also about the problem with his heart, and yet Yan had managed to put the whole thing to rest in that ridiculous manner. At least they had escaped the problem for the time being. After that, the tailor said he could finally attend to the clothes but complained about the lack of time. Yan replied that the prince still had a little time before the event. The attendant said that all was fine then and began the final adjustments to the ceremonial clothes. Shortly afterward, Yan asked Kalyan if today was the day. The prince immediately understood what he meant. By now, rumors about his health would soon begin spreading throughout the entire palace. That was why, that very night, he absolutely had to find Elon. But later, when the luncheon between the princes was supposed to take place, the butler appeared announcing an unexpected change. According to him, His Majesty had decided to hold private audiences with each prince individually. When Kalyan entered the private audience, he was quite nervous. He truly had not been expecting this. So he entered the chambers of Roman Larun Kairis, the king of Kairis. Kalyan greeted His Majesty, but received no reply. The king simply ignored him. Even without being fully versed in Kairis's noble etiquette, the prince knew very well that this was extremely rude. Only after several seconds did the king tell him to sit down. First, the son offered birthday congratulations to the king. Then Romain asked how he was, and remarked that he looked well. Kalyan thought that even the servants passing through the corridors knew how quickly he had changed, and it was precisely in that moment that he understood why the king had arranged individual audiences. If he met all three sons at once, he would have to make the effort of sustaining a group conversation. By separating them individually, it was far more efficient, because for the king, even spending time with his own sons during his birthday was merely a waste of time. The more Kalyan observed that family, the more he saw how chaotic it truly was. A father who cared nothing for his sons, a first prince who was completely indifferent to everything, a second prince who was practically a troublemaker, and a queen powerful enough to even look down upon the king himself. And in the midst of all those people, there was someone trying to kill Kalyan. Later, during the public parade of the royal family, the prince appeared before the crowd, and everyone immediately noticed that he looked completely different. Plancha, on the other hand, seemed utterly drunk, as always. But the court gossips quickly noticed that something was off about the atmosphere within the royal family. Something had clearly changed. And at that evening's ball, everyone finally confirmed the rumors. There truly was a prince with black hair and red eyes. Kalyan had cut the fringe that had hidden his face, and was even wearing a red pendant. It was practically a public declaration that he would no longer hide. Later at the ball, Yan approached Kalyan to ask why everyone was staring so much at his clothes. The mood between the two was light, because the outfit had truly turned out beautifully, and even Seton seemed pleased. But Kalyan remarked that people were not staring merely because of the clothes' beauty. They were also wondering why he had appeared wearing such striking jewelry. He even explained that he had gone to great lengths to stop the tailor from covering his clothes in exaggerated ruffles. Even so, Yan said everything suited him very well. After that, Kalyan asked whether Yen's family was also in the capital. He then explained that his younger sister and father had returned to their hometown, while the rest of the family still lived in the capital, and would only set foot in the palace if they received an official invitation. He then asked whether he should have Raven prepared for him, but Kalyan noticed that Yan did not wish to continue talking about his own family, so he decided not to press the subject. Regarding Raven, Kalyan replied that it was not yet the right moment. He said there was someone he wanted to meet first, and then asked if Yan knew why this place was called Siegfried Hall. Yan replied immediately that he did. The name was a tribute to the surname of the first patriarch, and also to one of the 8 heroes of the War of Two Paths, Duke Sleiman von Siegfried. He was the only duke connected to the Siegfried family, and, despite possessing immense power, had remained loyal to the royal family for over 500 years, all to protect the territory of Sisfania. Even Baron was impressed hearing that story. Then Yan asked if that was precisely the person Kalyan wanted to meet, and he confirmed at once that yes, it was. It only took mentioning the name for Duke Sleiman von Siegfried to appear before them. A family with centuries of loyalty was exactly the kind of ally Kalyan liked, so he decided to discreetly test the Duke. Kalyan sent a small pulse of mana in his direction, and the man instantly turned to face the prince. In that moment, Kalyan thought he was truly remarkable. He had sensed the mana in an instant. Even so, he pretended not to have noticed the Duke's presence. Later, after the king's speech, everyone was invited to enjoy the evening. The king raised a toast to chaos, while Kalyan took advantage of the distraction to slip away with Yan. Raven was already prepared for the ride, and as always, showed himself to be intelligent and gentle. But Yan warned him not to be fooled, because that horse was known to become quite a troublemaker when Kalyan was not around. Then Yan asked if they were going only as far as the front gate, but the moment they drew near the gates, Kalyan heard an argument taking place. A man was being turned away by the guards. It was the mage Ellen Monosil. One of the guards was saying that he had no invitation and therefore could not enter, no matter who he was. Then Ellen asked whether Karis judged the social standing of guests solely by appearance. According to him, that was truly lamentable. Hearing this, Kalyan realized there was indeed a problem, but it also became clear that Ellen seemed to be stirring up trouble on purpose, almost as though he were looking for an excuse not to enter Karis. Shortly after, the mage simply turned around and walked away. When Kalyan tried to go after him, Yan quickly stopped him, reminding him that a direct order from the king forbade anyone from leaving, but Kalyan thought that if they let it go, they would lose Elon. So he rode off on Raven anyway, telling Yan to do what he could. The black horse leapt over the soldiers with with no difficulty whatsoever. Meanwhile, Yan was desperate for a few moments, but quickly regained his composure. He had received an order and above all, was the prince's subordinate. His mission was to protect him no matter what. So he faced the knights and declared that Duke Siegfried had permitted the prince to leave. One of the soldiers immediately demanded to know who he thought he was to use the duke's name in such a manner. Then Yan undid his tied hair and revealed his true identity. He was Yan Siegfried, the eldest son of the duke. Later, his own father heard the whole story and burst into laughter, saying he couldn't believe his son had done something so clever. He also mentioned that sending the boy away to look after that kid had perhaps been a good decision after all. But Yan replied that it had not been something good, because now his relationship with the king would likely be ruined. Even so, the duke explained that he did not intend to question the situation much. According to him, Romain thought too deeply about things. If the prince received the Siegfried family's support without suffering any punishment, that would practically be equivalent to officially acknowledging a friendly relationship between them, and most likely Brizen would find that troublesome. For that reason, it would be best to simply pretend nothing had happened, regardless of why Callian had left the palace. Meanwhile, on the road, Ellen finally stopped and asked the third prince why he was following him. Only in that moment did Callian realize the rumors were true. Seventh Circle mages truly did appear to stop aging. Then he asked whether Ellen truly intended to leave just like that. The mage replied that, when he had tried to open a closed door, he had found the threshold too high. In that instant, Callian thought that this infuriating man was clearly speaking in insinuations. Shortly after, Elon explained that he had gone after a closed door, while an open one stood before him. Then Callian countered by saying that perhaps he was so busy blocking the wind that he had forgotten to sweep the dirt from his own threshold. Translating all of that veiled exchange, the prince was essentially asking where on earth Elon had put his invitation. The mage replied that he hadn't expected the guards to make such a ridiculous error, but what surprised him most was something else entirely. The prince was not trying to apologize or flatter him. On the contrary, he was criticizing him directly. That was honest, brazen, and entirely unlike the false attitudes of other nobles. But then Elon noticed something strange about Callian. On instinct, he took the prince's left hand and injected mana into his body. In that instant, Callian felt a tremendous pain in his heart. It was as though the mana inside his chest had violently collided with Elon's mana, sending the two repelling away from each other. Afterward, Ellen commented that even when doors were closed, the wind could never be completely blocked. Right then, Callian realized the mage had already discovered the problem with his body, so he asked what that meant. The mage replied that, from a certain point onward, it would truly become impossible for him to continue using mana normally, but the real problem did not appear to be the mana itself. The boy might not have realized it yet, but there was something far worse happening inside his body. And in the end, Ellen also remarked that Kyrus treated all mages with contempt, even those who carried the blood of dragons. The great mage had come to that family on his own terms, and his intention was to make them all look like fools for having let such an important mage slip through their fingers right under their noses. Meanwhile, Ellen himself mentioned that perhaps his encounter with the third prince had truly been fate. He then asked why Prince Callian had come after him. The prince replied that he believed it was too, and that because of that, he needed his help. Ellen knew full well what Callian's situation was. The third prince was despised by all and surrounded by enemies within his own family, so the mage created a barrier of silence around the two of them so no one could hear the conversation, and asked whether his goal was merely to prevent things or to uproot the problem entirely. Callian replied that his ultimate goal was not the throne, but rather to use it as a means to reach another objective. That caught Elon's attention. The boy was interesting. The prince was following in Sesphania's footsteps and needed his help to get where he wanted. That was precisely why Elon found himself drawn to him and asked for the invitation to be extended once more. Then Callian knelt before the mage Elon, saluted him as his master, and invited him to the ball, and thus Elon Manasil accepted the invitation to help him. Later, Yan confirmed with his father whether truly no one knew who he was. No one could find out his identity. His father replied that he had already taken care of everything and told him not to worry. After that, Yan asked how Leia was. Duke Siegfried replied that she was doing well as the head of the lesser family that he had abandoned. He also said that if his son grew tired of this game of living as a servant, he could return at any time. He further mentioned that they probably would not see each other for quite a while, but Yan replied that they would meet again in 3 months. Then his father asked if he truly intended to give up that position. Yan's only answer was that the prince would soon turn 15. At that moment, Slayman asked his son if he knew what their family's nickname was. They were known as the Elephants of Karis. For a long time they had never coveted the throne, yet were still powerful. They were called kings of the animals, those whom even predators dared not touch, and who only rose up when it was truly necessary. Then he grabbed his son by the neck and said he was telling him this to show how strong their surname was. He said that Yan had inherited that strength and could do as he pleased. He then complained, calling his son an idiot for making him worry like that, while squeezing his neck even harder. Gasping for air, Yan protested that he was choking. Later, straightening his uniform, he said he needed to leave and that they would see each other next time. Slayman replied that he was truly a Siegfried through and through, even in that strange way of his. Still, he admitted to himself that he had grown curious about Callian and wondered when that boy had grown so much. He was different. He didn't know what the boy was planning for the future, but he decided he would keep an eye on him. The following morning, an exceptionally luxurious carriage, recognized by all, arrived in the capital. It bore the emblem emblem of 7 red flowers and a silver staff. It was none other than the renowned archmage Ellen Manaseel. As he walked, Ellen thought that his new disciple had done something rather charming. The previous night, Callian had asked him to arrive precisely at 9:30 and pass through the gates at that exact moment. Walking through the middle of all the nobility who hadn't stopped talking about him, Ellen realized that the prince had been waiting for the perfect moment to display him to the nobles and thoroughly upset the political game. The butlers received Manaseel and informed him that his majesty awaited him. Later, the king asked whether it was true that he wished to have lodgings within the kingdom. Ellen confirmed it and said he needed a residence in Kairos. Romain knew that to compete with Celeste, he would need someone as powerful as Ellen, but he found it strange that the archmage had offered himself in such a way, and therefore suspected he must be planning something. Then Ellen revealed that, the previous night, he had come across a black cat with red eyes in a nearby square. The cat was intelligent, so he thought to teach it a few things. However, since he had nowhere to stay, he needed a suitable place. Not understanding, Romain asked what exactly he intended to teach this black cat with red eyes. Then Ellen replied that he intended to teach magic, of course. And not only that, he also wished to create an environment that the cat would enjoy, but for that he would need the assistance of the master of the house, and perhaps a little tidying up as well. It was then that Ellen revealed he had decided to accept Prince Callian as his disciple. Therefore, Brisson would not be able to stop him. He also stated that he did not intend to spend the entire day teaching magic, and that if a bored master chose to assist his majesty, no one would have the right to interfere. After all, this was the true invitation from Prince Callian. The king replied that he would arrange a place for him to stay. He said the royal house was already so messy that it couldn't get any worse. Even so, he admitted he was curious, because he had always heard that the child had nothing particularly special about him. Upon hearing that, Ellen thought that the boy's physical condition was wretchedly special enough that it would be hard to find anything normal about him, and yet it seemed the king merely repeated what he heard from others, without truly knowing his own son. So the mage asked directly whether his majesty even knew his son's height. Romain simply turned his face away in silence. In that moment, Ellen realized it was true. The king knew absolutely nothing about his own son, so he explained that sometimes too much attention can become poison, while indifference can act as medicine, but in this case, he knew very well that being busy was merely an excuse. The king replied that he would consider that disrespectful attitude as an expression of concern for the prince. He said it was absurd to have to explain such a thing, but that he cherished all his children, especially Callian, because he was precious to him. He then suggested they conclude the conversation. But before he could leave, Ellen raised another barrier of silence and told the king to stop stalling. He then began listing the prince's symptoms. He said the boy had shortness of breath, chapped lips, a bluish tinge to his skin, and purplish fingernails. His clothes had been hastily adjusted because he had lost far too much weight. He also experienced dizziness upon waking and suffered from nosebleeds. Then Ellen looked directly at Romain and warned him that if he continued only watching from a distance, his son would end up dead. Meanwhile, one of Callian's maids informed Yan that it was nearly noon, and the prince had not yet had his morning tea, so Yan asked to have the tray brought to him, saying he would handle it personally. When he entered the room, he noticed his highness was still asleep. He thought this must have been difficult for him, but suddenly, Ellen appeared right beside him, asking whether the prince had not yet woken. The shock was so great that Yan asked where he had come from, but Ellen simply ignored the reaction. Irritated, Yan protested that this was extremely discourteous. Then the archmage replied calmly that he was well aware that people without permission were not allowed inside the palace. Right away, Yan asked if this meant he had broken in without authorization. Ellen replied pleasantly that with a little magic, that was not so difficult, so Yan asked him to leave, explaining that the prince's health had not fully recovered. But Ellen only asked if he truly didn't remember him. He said he had been in Baron some years ago, and called Yan Little Elephant. In that instant, Yan was inwardly panicking. His own father had guaranteed that no one would discover his identity, yet Ellen had recognized him immediately. At that moment, Callian himself woke up and asked how long he had slept. Then Yan simply informed him that he had a visitor. Recognizing who it was, Callian asked if that was his teacher. Later, Ellen handed the prince a small pouch full of pearls and explained that it was medicine. He said that at the moment, the boy was facing two problems. The first was the inability to use mana. The second was the fact that he was losing weight far too rapidly. Without explaining much at all, Callian could tell his teacher was very skilled at identifying symptoms. Then Ellen asked seriously whether he possessed the power of the blessing. The prince replied that he did. He had healing abilities and an affinity for magic. However, it seemed that even his healing power had disappeared. Perhaps there truly was some problem with his heart. But Ellen asked if he had never found that combination of healing and magic strange. Then Callian replied that he had imagined the blessing fortified his heart, since it was the source of mana. Ellen confirmed that was correct. The blessing's power did indeed strengthen the heart. However, his blessing had not disappeared. His heart had no problem whatsoever, and the mana was not blocked. The true problem was that the blessing was being used completely on something else, pushed to its absolute limit. That was why it could no longer heal wounds or sustain the body normally. Right then, Callian understood everything and asked whether he was being poisoned. Ellen confirmed it. He said that if not for the blessing, the boy would have died long ago. His body was being destroyed because the blessing was consuming muscles and mana to constantly neutralize the poison. That was precisely why his heart had begun rejecting the excessive strain. Upon hearing this, Callian recalled that in his past life, that body had been killed, but now he understood that the poisoning had begun much earlier. It had not been something planned at the last moment. It was a slow-acting poison, used to destroy his health gradually. Then a deep hatred took hold of him, not for himself, nor for Baron, who now occupied that body, but for the true original third prince, an innocent boy who had suffered alone until he died. The bloodlust that emanated from him in that moment was so intense that even Elon was startled. Afterward, Callian asked whether the medicine was an antidote. Elon replied that he had prepared it hastily, but was certain it would work. But then the prince asked what would happen if he continued taking both the poison and the antidote at the same time. Right away, Elon said that was madness. Even with the antidote, the poison would continue to take effect, only more slowly. He could not risk something like that without even knowing who was responsible. But Callian replied that he already had a suspicion. He believed the source of the poison was the tea he drank every morning. After all, he drank it in front of everyone, and no one else shared the drink with him. They had probably chosen that method precisely because it appeared safe. Then he realized that the true Callian had likely discovered what was happening to his own body in the previous life, and had decided to stop drinking the tea. That might have been exactly why they decided to kill him directly afterward. But now the situation was different. It was no longer the old Callian in that body, and precisely because of that, he had no idea what method they would try to use to kill him this time. He at least needed to find out who was behind all of it. So he asked Ellen to keep it secret until he found the culprit. If they discovered that the tea was the problem, Yan and the other servants could end up in danger alongside him. Ellen replied that the little elephant would be fine in any case. Even so, he understood the reason for the request and agreed to keep the secret. He then asked what he intended to do now. In that moment, Baron recalled his past life, when he had needed to deal with vile people to survive and reach the top. And in moments like those, he always ended up thinking of his own father. So Callian replied that he wanted to meet Elon the following night, outside the palace. Meanwhile, Planche was also having difficulty getting up. First because he simply did not want to rise. Second because he had gotten drunk again. The queen herself entered his room to scold him personally, complaining that he was late again and reeking of alcohol. She said he was still hopeless, even after having been stopped from drinking during the ceremony at the square. Irritated, Planche asked why she was there and told her to say what she wanted before leaving. Then the queen told him that Callian now had a teacher, and not just any teacher, but Ellen Manaseal himself, a 7th circle mage. Even the aristocrats were hesitating in the face of that news. But Planche only asked what that had to do with him. Then the queen drew very close and said he needed to ensure that all the effort she had made would not go to waste. She told him to get ready immediately, because many eyes would be watching, and it would be better not to disappoint her. In that moment, Planche said nothing, but the moment she left his room, he exploded in rage, smashed the bottle he was holding, and ordered all the servants to leave immediately. In his mind, all of this was Callian's fault. Later, the official parade for His Majesty Romaine's birthday took place. The princes rode just behind him, accompanied by the luxurious royal carriages, and some people, unlike what had happened in the past, were specifically waiting to see Prince Callian. Gradually, he was becoming less hated by the common people. As they rode through the parade, Yan asked how he was feeling. It was a relief to see he seemed better than the day before, but even so, he still shouldn't push himself too hard. Callian replied that he would rest properly afterward, and thought it might be the effect of the antidote. Breathing was certainly much easier now, and the pain in his heart had also diminished considerably. Then Yan informed him that the day's schedule was still long. After the parade, there would be an equestrian show, and, later, a ball. In Callian's mind, it seemed almost as though they were trying to kill the prince with one engagement after another. Even so, he told Yan not to worry so much, because he could still handle everything without a problem. But while surveying the crowd, Callian noticed a few people with fair hair walking hooded through the dark alleyways. Among them was someone he recognized immediately. It was Kiri, he was certain of it. Even the black horse, Raven, began to stir, trying to break away from the parade, while Yan struggled to control him. In that moment, Callian realized Raven was responding to his own feelings, but it was not yet the right time, so he stroked the horse and calmed him, saying it was all right. They would go after Kiri later. Deep down, he knew he needed to find Kiri. He needed to repay him for what he had done in his past life. Later, His Majesty was being received by Melfer Paloon, owner of the Paloon Empire. Callian recalled that it was he who had organized the equestrian show in place of the Brisson family. Because of that, the man had been dragged into a pointless power struggle, but that did not concern Callian in the least. If he was not mistaken, Randall would be injured during that equestrian show, and Baron Paloon would be hanged because of it. As soon as they entered the first hall, Callian immediately noticed the chandelier that would fall on the prince's head. That was far too suspicious. At an event where the king himself was present, how had the knights failed to check something as important as a massive chandelier hanging above the royal family? Just thinking about that commander made him irritated. Even so, perhaps he should help Paloon. Perhaps he could give him a chance to survive. So he quietly passed beside him and remarked that the chandelier above seemed a little unsafe. He then asked if it might not be better to check it once more. Paloon was confused and looked up at the chandelier without understanding. Later, the equestrian show was already in full swing. The audience was captivated by each performance, and Paloon himself was animated to be seated beside His Majesty the King. He had prepared far too much for this event and could not afford to waste this opportunity. But then he looked back at Callian and remembered the warning about the chandelier. As a precaution, he decided to check. When the staff examined the chandelier, they discovered that one of the cables had been cut. Had it not been for Callian's warning, the chandelier chandelier would have come crashing down directly onto one of the princes. This left Polun shaken. How had the prince known? Could it have been mere coincidence? Kalyan himself was also impressed by his response. After all, Polun had risen from his seat even while sitting beside the king, all just to check a chandelier. At least he was decisive, and that was good. Even so, Kalyan couldn't understand to what extent the Brisson family hated the Polunes to engineer an incident of that magnitude. It was then that Planche stared at Kalyan and said loudly that he did not know his own place. He further stated that he felt like vomiting just looking at that filthy, pathetic blood. Everyone heard this clearly. Outwardly, Kalyan feigned irritation, but inwardly thought that Planche had no idea what he had prepared. That was certain. He also knew Celice must be furious in that moment. And indeed she was. She thought that idiot should never have said something like that, especially not that day, but she also noticed that he had done it deliberately. Meanwhile, rumors about the second prince began to spread among the nobles. They said he only caused embarrassment in front of His Majesty Romain, that he was nothing more than a drunkard with no future prospects whatsoever. At the same time, many commented that if Ellen Manisil supported Prince Kalyan, then he would be a far more fitting candidate to assume the crown. That day, everyone would need to decide whom they would support. When the performance ended at sunset, Randell had managed to avoid the incident. Romain also showed little reaction to what had happened with Planches. For Kalyan, everything was unfolding exactly as he had wanted. Even so, the queen remained far too quiet for someone who had supposedly planned the incident against the Polunes. Strangely, perhaps even she had not anticipated it. While thinking about this, Baron recalled a chess match he had once had with his brother Chase. On that occasion, Chase had asked whether he truly believed the incident in Karis had been merely a terrorist attack against the royal family. So Baron had asked if there was any other reason to try to hurt the prince. But Chase would not give the answer so easily. He said that would take the fun out of it. They could make a bet, or he could just offer a single clue. According to Chase, the incident was far too blatant, almost as though those responsible wanted to be caught attacking the royalty. And there was a simple reason for that. If the owner of Karis's second largest empire were to be eliminated, the one who stood to benefit most would be Renan Brizan, owner of Karis's most powerful empire. After all, without the Polonese, he would have no more competition. Kalyan had also learned through Yan that the Polun Empire owned a diamond mine, so everything began to make sense. If the Polunes were eliminated, the Brizan Empire would be able to exert influence over the diamond market. Renan was quite clever, and after observing the whole situation, had decided to save Baron Poluna's life. But now Kalyan intended to take advantage of that, so he had Yan cancel all engagements after the performance. Yan was baffled and asked why. Kalyan replied that the remarks he had heard earlier had been far too shocking for him, and Yan genuinely believed it, growing concerned. But the third prince explained that because of that, he would not be able to attend the ball that evening. Meanwhile, Romain was in his reception room, lost in thought. He recalled Elon's words about his son, and also thought of Kalyan's mother, but his thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Queen Celice. A maid appeared to change the teacups and pour a fresh one for the queen. Celice herself noticed that another guest had been there before her, but Romain only told the maid it was fine, as she would not be staying long. Afterward, he asked what she wanted. Celice sat down and began to speak about the incident that day, asking whether Brisson would take responsibility for the situation. Romain realized that Planche's loose tongue had ultimately discouraged the queen, yet she remained arrogant even so. Then Celice remarked that the performance that day had been impressive and suggested rewarding Baron Polun for having conducted everything so well. But Romain replied that the very fact she said that made it obvious she had something in mind. After all, he knew very well how Celice operated. So the queen proposed the idea of granting Polun exclusive rights over the supply of royal horses and the management of the stables. The king was surprised, because that was extremely lucrative, and, as Elon had said before, she was right. Earlier that day, in that very same room, Elon had explained to the king that there was absolutely no chance Celice would give up the royal guards over that incident. That was too important for her to lose. However, she would offer an appropriate price in exchange. Therefore, His Majesty should pretend not to know anything. So Romain decided that during the ball that evening, Planche would enter alongside him. The queen immediately broke into a wide smile and said that her son would be very pleased to hear that. And that was exactly what happened. During the ball that night, Romain and Planche entered together. Furthermore, as a reward for the performance, Polun received the exclusive rights over the management of the royal horses and stables. Everyone noticed that this was clearly a deal struck between Romain and Celeste to benefit Planche. But the following morning, the one who ended up receiving an enormous pile of gifts was Kalyan. Yan asked what he should do with so many presents, but the prince replied that he had no need for false people who changed sides so easily, so he had everything sent to the Mages Association, with the exception of the 2 gifts sent by Baron Polun. Even so, he asked Yan to check who had sent each gift, in case anyone important was among them. When Yan opened the Baron Polun's gift, it revealed a luxurious necklace for Raven, covered in jewels, a large and extraordinarily beautiful collar. Kalyan was bewildered as to how that had ended up there. Yan explained that Baron Polun had asked what the prince cared most about, and he had replied that it was his horse. Even so, Kalyan remarked that Raven was receiving a more luxurious necklace than anything he himself had ever been given. In his view, Polun was trying to discover the prince's true intentions, because if he accepted the gift, the Baron would probably send another one afterward, as a way of expressing his gratitude for having his life saved. saved. But for Kalyan, Paloon's life was worth far more than a few jewels, so he told Yan to ask the Paloon Empire for the value of that necklace, because he wished to pay for it. When Yan asked why he didn't simply accept the gift, Kalyan replied that he wasn't paying out of fascination with it. In truth, what had really caught his attention was something else sitting there in the corner. So Kalyan pointed to a carnivorous plant with a dark and sinister aura. Yan drew closer and explained that it was a gift from the Mages Association. Kalyan remarked that he had heard mages typically didn't have much of an aesthetic sense, but Yan replied that according to the letter sent along with the plant, it was extraordinarily rare. After it died, the flower's pollen would glow in the dark and drift through the air, which was why many enthusiasts adored the plant. Upon hearing this, Kalyan had a wonderful idea. He even liked the way the artist seemed to emphasize his every move, first from behind, then slowly turning, until that moment of pure realization emerged. A true eureka. So he said to leave the plant right there, because he had just thought of something interesting. Later, he and Yan put on a little act. Kalyan pretended to spill some tea on his own hand, as though he had burned himself. Then Yan quickly asked the maids to clean everything up. The cup fell to the floor, and the tea spread everywhere. Some of the liquid even reached the plant's pot. One of the maids noticed that the plant seemed to have reacted poorly to the tea. Then Yan asked whether it would be alright. Kalyan replied calmly that it would. After all, it wasn't as though there were poison in his tea, was it? The moment he said this, the maid was utterly stunned. Even so, he continued, telling them to leave the plant where it was, because he had grown quite fond of it. Sometime later, Kalyan and Ellen were riding discreetly, far from the palace. During the ride, Kalyan thanked him for the help he had received. Ellen replied that all of this had happened because of a certain prince's outrageous request to take both poison and antidote at the same time. How could he forget something like that? Even so, he noticed that Kalyan seemed far happier now that he was outside the palace. The prince then asked why that might be. He had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Upon hearing that, Ellen even wondered if he had nearly let something important slip for the first time. In the end, Kalyan simply remarked that this was his first time going out like this after so long. Then Ellen asked whether His Highness had permitted this outing. Ellen replied that he probably hadn't, and that he was likely receiving news of it at that very moment. Kalyan knew this would happen, but he was not in a position to criticize anyone, since he had simply ridden off and left Yan behind. Ellen replied that was exactly it. He then asked if that didn't mean abandoning his own disciple. Shortly after, the mage asked a serious question and wanted to know whether he had truly taken the antidote correctly. Kalyan replied that yes, both yesterday and again that day. Thanks to the medicine, his body felt much lighter now. Moreover, the person who had served the poisoned tea seemed blatantly nervous. He had planted an interesting seed, literally. Ellen commented that his student was so talented that he might not even need him anymore, but Kalyan replied immediately that he still very much needed him, master. Afterward, the two began to bid farewell to that brief, discreet ride. The mage explained that unfortunately they would need to go their separate ways from that point on. Since the prince himself had insisted on going alone, there was no stopping him. Kalyan thanked him for understanding. Before parting, Ellen reminded him once more that the Mages Association was on Tainensha Street and said he would be waiting there should the prince turn up. Then Kalyan promised that the two of them would meet again. They set off in different directions, but perhaps they were heading toward the same destination in the end. Before stopping by the Mages Association, Kalyan visited a blacksmith to commission a dagger. He wanted a beautiful weapon, with a simple gleaming hilt and a black blade. That was already perfect for him. In addition to the small temporary sword he already carried, he had now also commissioned a custom-made sword. But he still needed information. To spy on other nations, his homeland Sakritia maintained secret agents spread across the entire continent. They were far more efficient than ordinary informants, and had been managed by the kingdom for many years. Beyond being spies, they were all trained assassins and expert disguisers. The one who had created and organized all of this was de Blanc, the king of Sakritia and Baron's father, and in the past Baron himself had participated in it. Later, Kalyan arrived in front of Nalangsha, a carrier pigeon rental shop, or rather Baron, now living as Kalyan, knew that place very well. After all, he himself had managed one of its information points there for a long time. The street was practically deserted, with only a few drunks wandering back and forth. That made his disguise considerably easier, but he still needed to be careful. After all, he was the third prince of Karis. He could not simply be seen walking freely outside the palace. The problem was that his hair and eyes drew far too much attention. When he entered the shop, he noticed several cages of carrier pigeons scattered throughout the place. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Then the shopkeeper asked if he was looking for a carrier pigeon. Kalyan replied by saying those birds seemed to never wake from their sleep. The man replied that they did sleep quite a lot. Then Kalyan remarked that they must have come from very far away, because they looked utterly exhausted. There could be no better reason for them to sleep like that. After all, there was no better place for a tired bird to rest. But Kalyan knew very well that those birds were fake. Then the shopkeeper asked directly what he had come to retrieve. Kalyan replied calmly that he needed some birdseed. The man said they did indeed sell birdseed there, but in the very next instant he drew a knife and pressed the blade against Kalyan's neck, slicing through part of his hood. He then said coldly that regardless of that, he did not recall having sold any birds recently. Kalyan knew that man was no ordinary person, but he also understood it would be difficult to deal with him in his current body, so he simply placed his hand lightly on the knife and pushed it aside, saying that this little bird had just left the nest and was looking for food. For that reason, it couldn't be sold just yet. In that place, birds were codes used for secret agents who collected information. Secretia kept the identities of its agents in absolute secrecy, even from one another, precisely to prevent information from leaking should any of them be captured. The logist then asked whose bird it was. Callian knew that if he used the name of his father from his past life and pretended to be a Secretia agent, no one would notice the lie, so he answered that it was a bird of Nebulaid, which was actually an anagram for Debula. The logist was clearly shocked by this. Taking advantage of the reaction, Callian calmly asked him to give a little birdseed to that newly hatched bird. From that moment on, he would begin acting as the first prince of Kairos, using Secretia's secret agents to steal information. Later, he was led to a secret passage. The logist remarked that he must be a new recruit and asked him to memorize his name, since they would likely be meeting frequently from that point on. He introduced himself as White Eagle. Callian then responded that his name would be Red Swan. White Eagle asked what kind of birdseed he needed. Callian answered that he wanted one item and one piece of information. The man then asked for 8 plurins as advance payment. At that moment, Callian thought he might be trying to trick him, but White Eagle simply replied that was the fixed price. Later, the man truly delivered everything he had promised, the item and the information he needed. Before leaving, however, White Eagle gave one final piece of advice, saying that place was extremely cruel. Callian merely thought that, no matter how dangerous that place was, it perhaps still wasn't more frightening than himself. However, when trying to return home through the nighttime streets, he noticed a large crowd of people gathered together. He tried to pass without drawing attention, but he and Raven had their path blocked. Callian asked why they were blocking his way, and one of the hooded figures apologized, explaining that a deceased person was departing on their final journey. For that reason, if it wasn't urgent, they asked him to wait just a moment. It was then that Callian realized he was in the middle of a funeral. He hadn't even noticed before, so he replied that it was fine, he would wait there. As he watched, he began thinking about how funeral customs changed from one nation to another. In Kairos, red flowers were left floating along the river. There was a legend that said if someone crossed the bridge at that moment, the deceased would end up losing their way. In Secretia, they placed a special flower called Sinistar over the grave. During the day, it bloomed white. At night, it glowed blue. The Sinistar symbolized that the living and the dead would never meet again, representing the separate paths between the two worlds. Callian began to wonder whether his brother had placed a Sinistar on his grave before time had turned back. Perhaps he himself was the deceased who had ended up lost along the way. The hooded figure thanked him for his patience and said he could now continue on his way. At that moment, Callian remembered that he was now the third prince of Kairos, so he mounted his horse, revealed his face, and said he would pray for the soul of the deceased, wishing them to rest in peace. When he departed from there, Arson was quite surprised. Callian already knew it was him, but Arson simply commented that the boy seemed to be a good person. Along the way, Callian began noticing several establishments bearing the name Sisphania. There was Sisphania's Deep Sleep, Sisphania's Food, Sisphania's Rest, and even Sisphania's Deep Alcohol Aroma. When he was still barren, he had already heard stories that Sisphania seemed to be everywhere in Kairos, and apparently that was truly the case. Upon entering one of the establishments, the man who received him said he could take him to an empty spot, but Callian replied that he wanted the 4th floor of that building. The man was visibly surprised, but quickly asked him to follow, saying he would take him there immediately. The detail was that the building clearly did not have 4 floors. He was led to a room at the back. Then, recalling the information he had received along with the birdseed delivered by White Eagle, he found a hidden lever and activated the mechanism. As expected, there was a secret basement. Only the information he was seeking was not something as simple as a betting table where money flowed freely, though that was indeed happening down there. The place was far deeper and darker than it appeared. Passing through many men completely addicted to gambling, Callian reached an illegal fighting arena. At that moment, 2 men were practically killing each other inside the arena. In the end, the one who remained standing was Gerard, the bloodthirsty. The announcer declared that those who had bet on White could come to receive their dividend certificates for exchange. Meanwhile, some gamblers cursed furiously, saying that damned man should just die already, because they had lost a fortune betting on him. Others enthusiastically celebrated Gerard's victory. Callian felt disgusted by that environment. The constant smell of blood and that scene where all humanity seemed to disappear were things he deeply despised. Upon entering, he still had to pay an entry fee. After that, he was guided by one of the establishment's waitresses. Apparently she could not speak, so she only gestured to indicate the way. Callian quickly noticed that her ears had been cut off. Moreover, she clearly seemed uncomfortable wearing those short clothes. All the waitresses also wore tracking devices fastened to their necks. This made it evident that they had no way to escape from there. At a certain point, the waitress pointed to tray number 27, indicating that he needed to place a bet. Callian decided to simply go with the flow until he got what he really wanted. The rules of that place were simple. You bet. People fought. If the fighter you bet on won, you received double the amount, and then the cycle continued endlessly. Later, the 10th fight of the night was ending. In front of Callian, there was already an enormous pile of money. He had turned just 3 coins into 1,536. The arena's staff were already beginning to talk about him discreetly, but Callian's goal there was not merely to win money. Then came the main fight of the night, a special match, worth 4 times the normal betting amount. On the white side was Sean the Bloody Hammer. The challenger would be the man known as the Relentless. The moment he saw that man, Callian realized he had finally found the one he was looking for. This This was someone extremely important to Baron's past, the man who in his past life had mentioned that he used to fight in illegal arenas to earn money, though he took no pride in it whatsoever. The challenger of that night was precisely the man who had saved Baron in his past life, the relentless Kari. As soon as he was announced, Kalyan immediately went all in on Black. Even the waitress serving him was shocked. People around began asking if that boy was crazy, because he clearly knew nothing. Kari's win rate was 0%. He had never won a single fight. The man beside Kalyan even tried to warn him, saying he was just throwing his money away, and that it was far better to bet on the other fighter. After all, that wretch had never managed to win even once. Even so, Kalyan simply asked the waitress whether she had checked everything correctly. He then asked her to take good care of his chips. The other man replied that it was none of his business, but that he was only trying to offer advice. Sean the Bloody Hammer was known for being cruel and utterly vicious. As soon as the two entered the arena, most of the crowd began shouting his name, urging him to finish off that newcomer at once. Some people laughed, saying the rookie bettor had lost all his money out of pure greed. Kiri himself listened to all of it in silence as he prepared to fight. Sean then provoked further, saying that thanks to some wretch who somehow was still alive, that brat would end up losing all his cash. Then the main fight of the night finally began. Despite his enormous size, Sean was extremely fast. In the very first move, he advanced, pressing Kiri without giving him room to breathe. A brutal kick sent him crashing against the arena fence, making blood run from his mouth. Kalyan felt worried watching this. He knew very well that without a sword, Kiri couldn't fight at his full potential. Even so, the young man kept resisting. Kiri tried attacking quickly, but couldn't land hits on his opponent. The physical difference between the two was obvious. He was being completely dominated. Then, when he was thrown against the fence once more, Kalyan himself called his attention in the middle of the fight. He warned him that before attacking, he shouldn't expose his shoulder. Kiri was confused for a moment, thinking about what that meant, but in the next exchange of blows, he noticed the mistake. This time, he didn't leave his shoulder open. He dodged Sean's punch, and finally managed to land a clean hit right in the giant's stomach. And after that, the situation completely turned around. Kiri launched an incredible series of punches that brought Sean the Bloody Hammer down without giving him any chance to react. The entire crowd was in shock when the newcomer, with a 0% win rate, managed to win his very first fight. Immediately, everyone began cursing Sean relentlessly for having made them lose money by betting on him. Meanwhile, Kari simply stared at Kalyan, who watched everything with a wide smile on his face. Only the problem came shortly after. One of the arena's staff approached Kalyan, saying that someone was looking for him and that he needed to come along immediately. Later, he was brought before the owner of the arena and casino. The man remarked that he was quite talented, having managed to turn just 3 coins into over 6,000, but he also said he was concerned about handing such a large sum to a child like him. Kalyan replied that he thought the man would at least try to negotiate. Apparently, he was more of an idiot than he seemed. The casino owner grew irritated and asked who was protecting that boy for him to act with such boldness. Then he ordered him to take off his hood and show his face already. But Kalyan calmly replied that things would become quite troublesome if he did that. At that moment, around 10 subordinates approached, pointing knives and swords at him. However, when the first one tried to lay hands on the prince, Kalyan reacted immediately, driving a knife into the man's hand. He then said, with disappointment, that he thought the only useful thing that place still had was common sense. The casino owner replied that it was too much money to simply hand over all at once, but Kalyan made it clear that he didn't want the money. He wanted Kiri. The man was outraged and replied that their master would never allow that, because that wretch had just started generating money for the arena. While thinking that this brat must be crazy, the man tried to convince himself he still had the upper hand. After all, no matter how skilled the boy was with a knife, they were still the majority. Only that thought vanished the very next instant. Kalyan made a quick slash through the air and cut across the table with an aura attack using just the knife. The strike completely destroyed the casino owner's clothing, leaving the man practically in his underwear in front of everyone. In that instant, he realized it truly was aura and panicked, ordering them to bring Kiri immediately. Yet while maintaining his calm composure, Kalyan himself was already at his limit. He hit his mouth with his hand as he discreetly spat blood, thinking he couldn't use that strike a second time. His body simply wouldn't withstand it. He then realized he needed to finish this quickly before he passed out. Shortly after, one of the guards came running back and reported that there was a problem. Kiri was refusing to leave without a girl named Hina. It was at that moment that Kalyan remembered that at that time, Karya still had a younger sister. In his past life, he had never been able to save her while she lived in that arena. That had ended up becoming one of the greatest regrets he carried for the rest of his life. Even so, the casino owner simply replied irritably that it didn't matter whether it was 2 or 3 people. He told them to bring everyone over at once. So Kalyan himself decided to go fetch them personally. But before that, he made it clear that he wanted his money back. Later, the siblings were finally being rescued by him. Even so, the 2 of them remained suspicious and withdrawn. Kiri thanked him, but asked why he was doing all of this. Kalyan simply placed his cloak over Hina's shoulders and told them not to be so suspicious. He said he had no ill intentions. It was then that Kiri finally recognized his face. In that very instant, he begged forgiveness, addressing him as Your Highness and saying he had not been able to recognize him before and had even dared to suspect him. But the prince told him not to lower his head. He said he was not someone who needed to do that. Kalyan understood their situation very well. Half-elf siblings, with no money and no one to protect them. He then also commented on the habit Kiri had of exposing his shoulder during fights, explaining that it was something common among novices who practiced fencing. He then asked whether he wanted to become a knight, but Kiri replied that wasn't exactly what he wanted. He said he wished only to become a sword capable of protecting everything, not necessarily a knight. That greatly excited Kalyan. He then handed the young man a sword and said that perhaps he couldn't be a knight just yet, but he could act as his protector, and if he still wished to learn how to use a sword while doing so, he could come find him at the palace. Kiri couldn't understand why he was receiving such a good opportunity just like that. Kalyan answered only that, in the future, he would need a good sword at his side, but deep down, he knew that was his way of repaying everything Kiri had done for him in his past life. Meanwhile, in Ellen Manassil's office at the Mages Association, he was analyzing a recently arrived message. According to the mage sent to accompany the equestrian presentation, the one who had warned Melfer Poloon about the candelabra had been Prince Kalyan, and thanks to that, Melfer Poloon ended up discovering the cut rope above the prince. Ellen Manassil himself was left wondering how his disciple had known about that, and as if summoned by the thought, Kalyan appeared at that very moment. Ellen Manassil immediately asked what had happened, wanting to know if he had gotten into a fight. After all, the state of his clothes was terrible. The prince simply replied that a few little things had happened. The mage then commented that, judging by how calmly he said that, what he had done that day must have been something quite complicated. Kalyan admitted it had been an extremely long day. He had managed to find Kiri, set a trap to uncover the culprit behind the poisoned floor, and overall, everything was following exactly as planned. Even so, something still left him uneasy. Perhaps because he had done too many things in too short a period. Ellen Manassil himself was astonished by his disciple. He then began serving tea using magic, making the beverage pour itself into the cups. Seeing that, Kalyan remarked that he was finally seeing an office that truly looked like a mage's. After all, tea serving itself was exactly the kind of thing he had imagined. But Ellen Manassil asked what he expected to find there. A strange soup full of bubbling oils? Kalyan replied that, actually yes, because the office was far more normal than he had imagined. Even so, one thing caught his attention. There was an unsheathed dagger on the table, something that didn't fit the decor of the place at all. But then he realized that dagger was his own weapon. Ellen Manassil asked why he thought the dagger was there, and said it truly should be in that place. Shortly after, using telekinesis, he sent the blade flying directly toward Kalyan's heart. Observing the prince's reaction, Ellen Manassil remarked that for someone with such a weakened body, he was quite fast. Even while spitting blood, Kalyan managed to deflect the weapon's trajectory using his own blade. The mage then explained that it was a magical tool created by Sisphenea, capable of copying the hidden weapon carried by the opponent. It worked as a kind of warning. At that moment, Kalyan realized that from the very beginning, Ellen Manassil had genuinely intended to attack him as a test. With no patience left to keep hiding everything, he activated his aura. Sensing it, Ellen Manassil asked since when he possessed aura, because that made no sense for someone who barely knew how to use a sword. He explained that since their first meeting, he had already found the prince strange, but had chosen to ignore it. But things had started becoming more and more suspicious. The king had mentioned that the prince was afraid of horses, and then suddenly he became a different person. Furthermore, when he discovered he was being poisoned, instead of fearing death, he showed a thirst for blood. To Ellen Manassil, that energy clearly belonged to someone who already had blood on his hands. Not to mention that Kalyan knew an incident would occur during the equestrian presentation before it even happened. While speaking, Ellen Manassil was already using healing magic on the prince's body. Deep down, he wanted to believe in him, not suspect him, so he asked whether Kalyan could finally explain everything to his master. After a moment of silence, Kalyan revealed the truth. He said that in reality, he was not the true Kalyan. His real name was Baron Secretia. After hearing the entire story, Ellen Manassil spent some time trying to properly absorb everything. He then asked whether the true Prince Kalyan had died, but Kalyan replied that he believed not. In the beginning he hadn't known, but he could still feel the true prince's presence within that body. Even so, Ellen Manassil recalled that when they first met, he had said he did not covet the throne, so he asked what his true objective was. Kalyan replied that he only wanted to prevent the war. He still didn't understand why Planche wanted the axis of time, but if the root cause of the problem continued to exist, everything would repeat itself once again. For that reason, they needed to uncover the truth. But Ellen Manassil wanted to know one thing first. He asked whether Kalyan was doing all of this for his own sake or for the sake of Baron's brother. He then revealed something shocking. In Secretia, there was only one first prince, Chase. He had always been the only son of the royal consort. The queen didn't even have a male child. In other words, someone named Baron had never existed. Upon hearing that, Kalyan was completely shaken. He realized his existence simply didn't exist anywhere, not in Secretia, nor in any other country. He then began thinking that perhaps something had gone wrong when he traveled back in time using the axis of time. Perhaps the space-time had been distorted, and he had ended up taking over someone else's body. Ellen Manassil then explained that the current Chase had already secured his position as Crown Prince of Secretia. Just as the past and present were different from the reality Baron knew, the future had also changed. Therefore, he no longer needed to worry about Chase, because the prince was living very well. Kalyan understood that the mage was telling him to stop clinging to the past. He then explained that he understood his concern, but assured him that wouldn't happen. Since the day he had opened his eyes in Karis, he had already abandoned the idea of living as Baron once more. After that, he asked whether Ellen Manassil Manasil truly accepted all of this, even knowing he wasn't the true prince of Karis, but the mage replied that it had never mattered to him. From the start, there was only one person with whom he had formed an alliance, and that was precisely the man standing before him at that moment. Later, as they rode together, Kallian asked whether his master already knew about the axis of time, because it seemed as though he recognized the object from his reaction. Elon Manasil then told him that about a year ago, Prince Chase had also asked about the axis of time. He had even traveled secretly to Secradia to investigate the matter, but only discovered that the artifact had not been created by humans. Furthermore, a month ago he had received news that the axis of time had disappeared from Secretia, so he asked whether it wasn't exactly around that time that Kallian had appeared in that body. The prince then realized that the artifact had disappeared precisely when he traveled back in time. Unable to understand the reason for all of this, he asked Elon Manasil why he thought it had happened, but the mage replied that he had no way to answer that question yet. However, there was someone who knew far more than him, and who would soon meet the prince, Sisfania herself. At that instant, Kallian recalled that he would soon reach his coming of age. The Rosalita was the coming of age ceremony of Karis's princes, a ritual where they were officially recognized as members of royalty upon finding Sisfania's empty nest. It was in that place that they could hear her will, but Elon Manasil reminded him that none of that would matter if he died first. So he said the first problem to solve was the poison tea, but Kallian replied that the seed he had planted had probably already borne fruit. When he returned to his room, he noticed that the carnivorous flower received from the Mages Association was still alive and healthy. Then Jan appeared, saying that he had finally returned, and asked whether he had any idea how worried he had been. After all, the prince had said he would return by midnight, but it was already the early morning hours. But Kallian asked if he wanted to see something interesting. He then took Jan out to the terrace. Confused, Jan asked why they were there in the cold of the early morning. As he observed the plant, Kallian began explaining what he had discovered. That flower was extremely rare, so almost no one knew its properties. On purpose, he had spilled the poison tea near it to observe the reaction of the palace maids. The poison used was so strong that an ordinary person wouldn't survive even a week. If the plant had truly absorbed that poison, it should be dead. But the flower in his room remained perfectly alive. In other words, someone had swapped the original plant for another one. It was then that small beams of light began to appear in the darkness of the early morning, looking like many fireflies glowing through the air. Enchanted, Yan remarked that it was truly beautiful, and in that instant, Kallian finally understood. The flower glowed when it died, and those lights served to guide him to the culprit. The beams began advancing through the palace garden, and led directly to the personal garden of Queen Celeste Breeson. Kallian woke the following morning to the sound of rain beating against the window. His condition seemed much better than before, so much so that even Jan noticed the difference. When he brought the prince's tea, Kallian noticed on the very first sip that the dose of poison had increased once again. He then asked Yan whether there were any important engagements that day, and whether all the nobles would be present that week. Yan replied that the nobility conference would be taking place, and that even the king himself would attend. Upon hearing that, Kallian began to think. After the conference, there would be a grand banquet, and that would be the perfect moment for the poison to finally take effect. This meant that Celeste Breeson was accelerating her plan to the fullest. After finishing the tea, he discreetly took a dose of the antidote. When Yan asked what that was, Kallian casually replied that they were just vitamins to help him feel better. Even so, Yan remained suspicious. Something about that tea had been bothering him for some time. After the incident at the equestrian presentation, Planche stopped attending the prince's breakfasts. For Kallian, that was great. After all, it would be problematic if Planche ended up interfering with his plans as well. While eating, Kallian remarked to Randel Sale Karis that the roses would soon be blooming. The prince stared at him for a few seconds in silence and, after finishing his meal, simply left without saying anything. Confused, Yan asked why he had suddenly talked about roses out of nowhere. Kallian then calmly explained that he had seen some flowers while walking, and remembered that Randel Sale Kairis liked to cultivate them. There was no hidden meaning in it, or at least, that was what he said. Later, even with the rain falling heavily, Kallian continued his usual morning training. Seeing that, Elon Manasil asked whether his disciple was perhaps a masochist. Kallian replied that actually, things got worse for him whenever he stopped training. He then asked where the mage had come from. Elon Manasil replied that he had a quick conversation with Roman Laroon Karis, but was curious to know why he had been summoned there. Kallian explained that he needed to ask his master for two things. First, he wanted to discover the identities of two people. Elon Manasil replied that wouldn't be difficult. He then asked what the second request was. The prince explained that he also wanted to investigate suspicious cases involving nobles, particularly any incident related to the Brizons. Before he even finished speaking, Elon Manasil replied at the same time, because he had already expected precisely that request. Even so, he commented that his disciple was demanding too much of the old master by asking for two important things at once. That only showed he was in quite a hurry. Kallian then revealed that Celeste Breeson had increased the dose of the poison. Upon hearing that, Elon Manasil remarked that he had probably already found the culprit then. After all, he had already suspected who it might be. Kallian also warned that she would soon try to act against the mage himself. It might be difficult to attack someone as powerful as Elon Manasil, but that still created a good opportunity for them to grow stronger. The mage asked whether he intended to use him as a shield, but Kallian replied that he did not. He wanted to use him as a weapon. He knew the power of mages very well. well. After all, in the future, the White Demon's army composed of mages had destroyed his homeland and taken his life. He therefore told Manhwa that he wanted to create a mage troop, but the mage replied that mages were not knights, and that kind of organization was extremely difficult to develop. Even so, Kalyan insisted it was possible. At that moment, Manhwa reminded himself once again that his disciple knew the future. Kalyan then explained that when Romain Laruncaris proposed the creation of a mage squadron in the future, everyone had laughed at the idea, including the Breezens, especially the Breezens. No one thought it important enough to deserve attention, and it was precisely thanks to that contempt that Romain Laruncaris was able to continue the project without interference. In the end, he truly did create the squadron, but after the troop stabilized, he died under suspicious circumstances. After his death, the squadron ended up being handed to Planche, who had inherited the throne, and as for the results of that magical army, Manhwa already knew very well what they had been. Even so, Kalyan admitted that this time around it wouldn't be easy to repeat all of that. He then revealed that he intended to negotiate using Selase Brizen's poison tea case. Curious, Manhwa asked how he would do that, but Kalyan replied it was still a secret, and that he would explain afterward. The mage only commented, in a tired tone, that this was truly a very reassuring answer. Kalyan then suggested he ask Romain Laruncaris's opinion, because he was certain the prince would have a great deal to say on the matter. He intended to use the moment when Selase Brizen had made a mistake to manage to close the negotiation. Meanwhile, a maid was informing the queen that she would increase the poison dosage as ordered, but Selase Brizen replied that they needed to handle it properly, because she had been hearing worrying things lately. The maid replied that she would be careful. At that moment, Planche appeared, but seemed to have no intention of doing anything, so the queen coldly commented that the person who truly should be acting was doing nothing at all. He replied not to worry about it, saying he had only come to mention that, but Selase Brizen countered, saying that someone incapable of acting had no right to make decisions either. Afterward, she began acting as if she were a victim of fate itself, saying that all that suffering was inevitable for a poor queen like her. Upon leaving, Planche was extremely irritated. Even his own mother saw him as a weakling. At that moment, he decided he would personally ensure that nothing stood in his way. On the day of the palace entrance, the queen was in a fine mood, attending to her duties while humming pleasantly. At the same time, Kiri also seemed cheerful. Holding her sword, she communicated through sign language, saying she was finally going to the palace and would be able to meet the prince. They then asked whether she liked him. She immediately answered yes, wanting it to happen soon. Meanwhile, Kalyan was preparing for the important event of the day. Yan informed him that the nobility conference would begin shortly, and that the banquet would follow right after, within an hour. The prince then asked a favor of him. The time had finally come to put an end to the whole situation. The tea slowly poisoned to the weakest prince in the palace would finally be used against those responsible. Upon arriving at the banquet, Kalyan immediately looked directly at Selase Brizen. In his mind, this would be the decisive moment that would change everything. Meanwhile, Yan rode hastily to fulfill the task he had received. He delivered 2 letters, one to the Mages Association, and another to Manhwa. Even so, he remained worried. Was the third prince truly going to that banquet alone? But Kalyan had already said he could handle the rest alone, and that Yan shouldn't worry. Even so, Yan felt that it was very similar to something that had happened before, and that only heightened his anxiety. At the Mages Association, Aurea Saren, president of the organization in Karis, was finishing organizing some documents and books for Manhwa. She had gathered various official records, and commented that it seemed extremely suspicious that nothing had been revealed until now. Manhwa replied that the weaker nobles simply didn't have enough power to sustain an accusation against the Brezens. Aurea Saren then asked exactly how the prince intended to use all those materials. It was at that instant that Yan appeared hurriedly, bringing the 2 letters. After reading the contents, Manhwa immediately grabbed his coat and asked where the banquet was being held. Yan replied that he wouldn't be able to enter without an invitation, but the mage retorted that this was not the moment to worry about formalities. After all, his disciple might be dying. Summarizing the contents of the letter, Kalyan was essentially warning that he would be doing something enormously reckless that day, and that, if everything went wrong, he wanted Manhwa to save him. About an hour earlier, Kalyan was already alone with Selase Brizen, drinking tea together. He then remarked that the 2 of them should be sincere with each other that day. The queen replied that they could speak frankly, but that it wouldn't change anything. But Kalyan made it clear that when he spoke of sincerity, he didn't mean abandoning etiquette. Irritated, Selase Brizen asked if he had called her there just for that kind of discussion. She then commented that she regretted having been entertained for a moment. She further stated that, just like the tainted blood he carried, he was also extremely rude. But then Kalyan finally brought up the real subject, the poisoned tea. He said he was tired of pretending not to notice, and that he had been patiently drinking it until now. Even so, Selase Brizen feigned surprise and asked what exactly he was talking about. Kalyan replied with a wide smile on his face, saying he had been expecting that. He then began to prepare himself, because he felt he needed to put something at risk if he wanted to prevent her from repeating it in the future. But at that moment, the only thing he truly had was his own resilient heart, so he decided to put it to the test. He pulled from his bag a poison capable of stopping the heart for a few seconds. It was the same poison he had obtained from White Eagle. Moreover, he explained that it didn't react to silver and couldn't be detected by magic. Since he possessed the blessing, his heart wouldn't stop completely. The power of the blessing poisoning could only act on one thing at a time, so while it neutralized that poison, everything he had been gradually ingesting would spread throughout his body. After that, he asked who people would first suspect. Celeste Brisson began laughing upon hearing that, and asked whether he truly thought everything would go the way he wanted. She questioned whether he imagined this was the first time she had done something like this. She then revealed that it had been her who took his mother out of this world. Even so, Callian picked up the cup and asked what he should do with that tea. The queen replied that he could try to drink as much as he could manage. He took that as a rejection of his proposal and drank the tea without hesitation. Celeste Brisson remained calm. In her mind, he was simply pathetic. No one would dare suspect her. Not even the king would have the courage to treat her recklessly. There was no situation she couldn't manipulate to her advantage. After all, that was exactly how she had conquered the position of queen. Everything she had done was eliminate the inconveniences along the way. She had achieved practically everything she wanted, with the exception of one thing, completely dominating the king. As soon as Callian finished drinking the tea, he immediately collapsed to the floor. Blood began pouring from his mouth, giving a clear impression of poisoning. The queen observed this, thinking he would be just another stepping stone in her ascent, like all the other people she had eliminated before. The knights began to panic, asking whether it was poison. Some said it made no sense, since even his majesty had drunk from the same tea. But one of the servants ordered everyone to be silent, warning that they could lose their heads if they kept talking like that. Celeste Brisson remained calm, convinced that no one would have the courage to point at her as the culprit. To her, that victory was already guaranteed. But then Romain Laroon Caris ran to his son in complete desperation, ordering him to hold on. He then began asking where the priest was, and imploring Callian to keep enduring. At that moment, seeing his son in that state, the king remembered his former wife. He remembered the other queen, and above all, the promise he had made to protect his own son. Meanwhile, Celeste Brisson feigned concern and said it was truly a tragedy. She then stated she would return to her palace. But before she could leave, Romain Laroon Caris asked before everyone whether she was trying to kill his son as well. Everyone clearly heard those words. The princes, the nobles, and the servants all began commenting immediately. Even so, the queen maintained her composure and replied that she had no idea what he was talking about. According to her, Callian had always been a sickly child. The king then replied that she had said exactly the same thing when Freya died. At the time, after assembling all the Brisson knights, she had claimed that the death had occurred due to illness. Celeste Brisson, however, countered by asking who had said the boy was naturally healthy. She further commented that the princes who breakfasted with him every day knew very well about his health condition. She also said she was merely concerned and asked why the king was making such a fuss. She claimed to be concerned about Callian and about her own sons as well. The king grew furious and asked how she dared say that. However, before he could continue, Planche himself stood up and declared that it was hypocritical to call him a son after everything. Of all people, she was precisely the one who had the least right to speak about Callian in that way. He also said that Callian had always seemed healthy and that he had never noticed anything wrong with him. Furthermore, he recalled that the prince himself had said for no one to worry about his health. The queen was outraged to see her own son going against her. Shortly after, the priest arrived to treat Callian, but before he could use his divine power, a magical barrier blocked everything. The one who did that was Elon Menacil. He coldly stated that it would be better to simply let the boy die right away. The king was shocked and asked what he was doing, saying that Callian needed urgent treatment. Elon Menacil then explained that the prince had a magical circle in his heart. If that circle came into contact with sacred power, he would die immediately. Desperately, Romain Laroon Caris asked how they could save his son in that case, since he was dying. Elon Menacil then replied that only a healer with the power of nature could help him. Ordinary magic wouldn't work. The king ordered that a solution be found quickly, because he couldn't bear to see his son suffering like that. At that moment, Elon Menacil recalled a similar situation he had witnessed in the past. He looked at Callian, his disciple, and remarked that he thought he would never use that spell again in his life. Even so, he promised he would end his pain. After some time, news began spreading throughout the entire kingdom. People lamented for the victims who had been buried and implored for the truth about those monsters to be revealed. The Brisson family was exposed as human butchers responsible for the deaths of 37 people. All of this was revealed by the Mages Association. The Brisson family plunged into absolute chaos. Suspicions that the queen had attempted to poison Prince Callian, combined with the family's cruel crimes, came to light and caused outrage throughout the kingdom. The entire populace began crying out that Queen Celeste Brisson should be eliminated. Later, during a meeting with Romain Laroon Caris, Elon Menacil revealed another important piece of information. According to him, Prince Callian had mentioned the creation of a mage troupe, and that moment was perfect for acting while the queen had her back against the wall. Upon hearing that, the king realized that his son had arrived at exactly the same conclusion as him. Meanwhile, Celeste Brisson herself went to visit Callian. She remarked that the Mages Association must be quite busy, and asked when he had prepared a mage of that caliber. Callian replied replied that he had no idea what she was talking about, and said that he had simply been resting there the entire time. He even sarcastically thanked her for her consideration, since he had managed to rest quite well. The queen thought she had heard he had been between life and death for an entire week, but now he seemed completely fine. Kalyan then feigned weakness and said he was so unwell that it would be difficult to keep up a long conversation. He then said she had nothing more to say there and told her to leave. Celicy Breeson asked whether it wouldn't be better to negotiate one at a time, but Kalyan replied that she should have thought of that a week ago, because the situation had now changed. He then asked what exactly she had prepared to offer. The queen, already writhing with rage, replied that if he declared the accusations to be false, she would not oppose what he wanted. Kalyan then began to laugh and said she was misunderstanding everything. He didn't need her permission for anything. He then asked whether that was all she had to offer. Unable to hide her rage any longer, Celeste Brison asked what he wanted. Once and for all, Kalyan then finally revealed his demand. He asked how, in a land governed by the descendants of Cisphania, the sound of swords could be heard so loudly by everyone, and he declared that he wanted the revocation of the Pable Knights. From that moment on, the Brisson family would have no more control over any troops. Celeste Bresson immediately replied that it was outrageous. Kalyan knew very well what he was asking. If the Pable Knights were dissolved, the queen would lose practically half of her own power. Even so, he remained firm. He said he wanted the dissolution of Pable and the beginning of the founding of a mage troop. He wanted no other agreement beyond that. He then gave a command to Yan, who immediately delivered a document into the queen's hands. It was a testimony sealed with oath magic. Kalyan had prepared everything in advance. He explained that the oath seal was a magic capable of engraving the contents of the contract directly into the heart. Should anyone break the agreement, their very heart would be destroyed. Meanwhile, Randell Sale Karis learned that the queen had gone to visit the third prince as soon as he woke up. While calmly pruning his roses, he began recalling the words Kalyan had spoken before. He also remembered the moment their eyes had met shortly before he collapsed. At that instant, Randell Sale Karis realized something. From the very beginning, Kalyan had been planning to place him in that political game. Even so, he didn't seem irritated. On the contrary, he was curious to discover how those roses would bloom. For the first time, he was thinking of acting exactly the way he wanted. The fact that Planche had interfered was also something unexpected to him. Everything seemed to be slowly changing. Celeste Breeson, upon hearing about the judgment and the situation she was in, hesitated for a few seconds, but in the very next instant, she took the pen from Yan's hands and signed the contract. As soon as she did so, magic began flowing through both of them, connecting their hearts through the oath. The queen left there completely furious, but before she could depart, Kalyan said one more thing. He remarked that he had never had a good relationship with his brothers. However, that day, Planche had not interfered to help him. In fact, if he had said one more word to Celeste Bryson, the next head to roll would have been hers. The queen simply withdrew without replying. Later, Elan Menacil came to visit the prince and commented that he was shocked to learn that Celeste Brisson had come to see him. Even so, Kalyan appeared to be doing very well. Actually, a little too well. The prince was already devouring what must have been his 10th banana in a row, saying it was delicious. Elan Menacil then replied that after nearly dying, any food must taste wonderful. But Kalyan said that he had also done his part. The mage then asked how he could still smile after everything. After all, at that moment, they could have been visiting his grave had the elf siblings not appeared at just the right time. He also remarked that it had been an enormous stroke of luck that the girl, Hina, possessed nature-based healing powers, because Kalyan truly could have died. The prince replied that, honestly, he hadn't even known Hina was a healer. He had been completely shocked when he found out. Elan Menacil then asked whether he hadn't known that from his past life, but Kalyan replied that he had only had ties with Carrie, and that she had already passed away. Upon hearing that, Elan Menacil was indignant and asked whether he had really ingested that poison, relying solely on the power of the blessing. He then called him an idiot. He said that Kalyan had spent an entire week in bed without any countermeasure and practically pleaded with him to be more careful. Kalyan apologized, but shortly after Elan Menacil handed him a scroll and said he had a message to pass along. Inside were the identification certificates of the children he had requested. At that moment, Kalyan realized he had even forgotten about that. Now, he finally had in his hands the documents for Hina and Carrie. The two had been given the surname Baron. Elan Menacil then explained that they needed to put some surname on the certificates, so he decided to lend his old name. After all, he didn't believe Kalyan had brought those children along merely by coincidence. The prince immediately gave his thanks, especially since those documents were not forgeries. They were genuine identification papers. Moreover, Elan Menacil had also made a point of registering the children as belonging to his territory from the very start. However, he quickly corrected himself and said that it had actually been Roman Leroun Caris who ordered that. He then asked how the third prince felt, knowing that everyone was saying he was the son the king worried most about. Kalyan was surprised and asked whether people were truly saying that. Elan Menacil replied that it was obvious. After all, the king had practically lost control in front of all the nobles. It was impossible for rumors not to start circulating. Even so, Kalyan replied that it must be something another person should have felt, not him. Later, already quieter and more thoughtful, he asked Yan to collect the banana peels scattered around the room. But at that moment, Yan approached in silence and said he needed to say something important. He then revealed that he would stop being the prince's servant. When he was a child, Yan used to visit a secluded room on the second floor of the mansion. It was his brother's room. It was in that place that he left behind all the guilt he had carried. He told how he talked a great deal with his sick brother and enjoyed the company very much. He had also once overheard a conversation between his father and someone else. They were saying that his brother's condition had worsened greatly. His father suffered deeply because of it, but there was nothing that could be done. In those days, Yan didn't yet understand very well how the world worked. Then one day, his brother held his shoulders and told him to look directly at him. He said he shouldn't pretend that his death wasn't coming. Not long after, the house caught fire. That was how his brother, one day before turning 15, chose to abandon everything with his own hands. After that event, summer passed. Then came autumn, then winter, and Yan remained downcast the entire time. He withdrew more and more, until Slayman von Siegfried, tired of seeing his son that way, forced him out of his room. It was then that Yan, still feeling despondent, encountered another isolated child. The third prince, the child that everyone hated. At that moment, however, he realized he no longer wanted to stop being his servant. Confused, Kallian asked what he was talking about. Yan then replied that, even as the person closest to him, he hadn't noticed anything. It was through his hands that the poison had reached the prince. He was the one who delivered the tea every day. Because of the things he had overlooked, Kallian had nearly died. As he spoke, Yan began reliving those terrible memories of the fire. It was as if he were getting lost in those flames once more. But then Kallian called his attention and told him to look at him. He then asked who was standing right before him at that very moment. Yan replied that it was Prince Kallian. The prince then asked whether he still didn't understand. He was not going to die. It had been Yan who remained by his side the entire time. Thanks to him, he had managed to keep enduring everything until now. Moreover, Yan had only managed to survive in the past because he hadn't ignored his brother. Kallian then said that perhaps they still didn't know everything about each other, but he was certain of one thing: the two would continue protecting each other from that point on. Upon hearing that, Yan finally broke down in tears. In that instant, he realized he would probably never be able to return to his old home. Now there was someone he needed to protect for the rest of his life. Later, he even promised Kallian that he would eliminate every wretch who had made him suffer. The prince asked whether he was talking about taking revenge on his behalf. Yan replied that it was obvious, because Kallian had been hurt far too much. But the prince told him to drop that idea. He said that elephants must remain quiet, because any wrong move could start a war. Yan asked how Kallian knew about elephants, and whether he had known about that for a long time. Kallian only replied that he found out somehow. Yan then commented that it was probably his father who had told him. As they spoke, Kallian even thought he wanted to make a bet with Yan to see if one day he would grow taller than him. But on that very same night, Kallian ended up having a farewell, and it was not with Yan. In his dreams, he encountered the presence of the true Kallian, that boy who was happy with the little company he had, and who truly treasured the few friends by his side. Baron tried to reach him, but the two ended up separating. When he woke up, Kallian immediately went to tell everything to Elon Manasil, and prepared a funeral for the true Kallian. Elon Manasil asked whether, in the end, he had truly disappeared. Kallian replied that he had. He honestly thought the boy would want to make more use of that chance, but that wasn't what happened. The true Kallian had been in a hurry to depart. Before leaving, he said he would entrust that life to Baron and give him what he desired. For that reason, he wanted him to fulfill his objective to the end. Even so, Kallian said that that life was precious as gems. Now the boy was finally free. After all of that, he decided that he would no longer pretend not to know things. He had already initiated many plans, accepted many favors, and because of all that, he resolved to truly live his second life. Shortly after, it was announced that the Pabal troops would be dissolved and returned to the command of the Marquis of Brisson. Meanwhile, Romain Laroon Caris ordered that no one believe the rumors spreading about the royal family. At the same time, Elun Manasil officially announced that he would create the mage troop. 3 months later, Kallian's clothes were no longer fitting him properly. Marilyn Fiat asked whether they could call Mr. Seton Slake, and Yan replied that they could. He said they should inform him that some clothes needed adjustments, as the current ones were already far too small. Kallian had truly grown a great deal. When Romain Laroon Caris saw the prince again, he remarked that he seemed much taller than the last time, and that perhaps he had already surpassed even Planche in height. Kallian replied that he had only grown just a little bit. As they had tea together, Kallian asked whether Ellen Manasil had finished the preparations for the Rosalita. He replied that he had, since the prince's birthday was approaching. He then explained that the reason he had summoned him there was to introduce the mage who would serve as his guard during the ceremony. And it was at that moment that Arsene Hertz appeared, the same mage who had killed Kallian in his past life. Romain Laroon Caris explained that he was an extremely talented mage and would be part of the future mage troop. He also said he hoped the two would grow closer over time. Kallian had to keep all his rage in check, and simply commented that it was quite a special birthday gift. Later, everyone began discussing when the mage troop would finally be created. Ellen Manasil said there was no set date yet, but explained that they already had some names, an initial number of members, and even uniforms prepared. But nothing was confirmed yet. As they talked, Arsene Hertz simply watched Kallian with a small smile on his face. Ellen Manasil then remarked that the troop still didn't have a name, and asked why the king didn't choose one, since it had been him who decided to create it. The king replied that he had actually already thought of a name. The troop would be called Valken. Kallian then asked Arsene Hertz what he thought of that name. The mage was confused at first, and asked what he was referring to. The prince then repeated himself, asking whether he liked the name Valken, and whether it seemed familiar. Arsene Hertz Hertz replied that he liked that name quite a lot. Later, Callian told everything to Elon Manasil, who was surprised and said he had no idea about any of it. He also said he could remove Arkan Hertz if the prince wished, but Callian refused. He said there was no need. Yes, it was Arkan Hertz who had killed him in the past, but now everything was different. Circumstances had changed and the future he knew might not even come to pass anymore. Even so, he couldn't help but feel a sense of injustice at the thought of simply overlooking everything. And when Callian said that, even Arson Hertz himself felt a chill. Sometime later, Callian also had a meeting with Melfer Paloon. As soon as they arrived, he asked the man to make himself comfortable, and also apologized for having hidden his identity and appeared without notice before. He asked whether it was really that difficult to expose oneself. Melfer Paloon immediately replied that he was exceedingly honored that the prince had come looking for him personally. Deep down, he realized that Callian had not yet approached practically any noble, so that visit was a very good sign. The prince then got straight to the point. He said he was there to collect the reward for having saved Melfer Paloon's life. The man asked what the prince would like to receive in return. He had been expecting that conversation. He explained that he had recently begun trading diamonds with Tensil and even horses and stables with the imperial family, but he knew that wasn't the answer the prince wanted to hear. Callian then replied that he didn't want to exchange commodities. He then asked whether Baron Melfer Paloon would be able to manage something beyond his own emporium. The man replied that with sufficient staff and money, that wouldn't be a problem. The prince then explained that he had staff and money, but that Bresson also had the same resources. Melfer Paloon asked whether they wouldn't have the prince himself on their side. Callian replied that had been a silly question. Of course he would be on their side. After that, Melfer Paloon affirmed that having staff, money, and even Prince Callian against Bryson managing that would be no problem at all. The prince then revealed the true plan. They were preparing the creation of a mage troupe. They had enough money and people to assemble everyone, but they needed someone capable of properly managing it all. Melfer Paloon then asked whether that was the price for his life. Callian replied that it was, and without hesitation, Melfer Paloon accepted the task. At that moment, Callian thought that he had finally managed to change destiny. In the original timeline, he was supposed to die after the ceremony of his 15th birthday, but now everything had changed before that could happen. He had people he could trust by his side. The only thing still missing was to discover Sisvania's will during his Rosalita. When he walked out into the ceremony hall, everyone received him with enthusiasm, since it was his coming-of-age birthday, 15 years old, and Callian was happy, not exactly because of the party, but because all the preparations were finally complete. Plancha was also present. Callian only commented that it had been a while since they had seen each other, brother, but before he could even pass by, Planch murmured something about bloody eyes. Callian replied that he wouldn't let that pass and stated that his name was Callian, but Planch continued staring at him with suspicion. He asked whether he truly believed he was Callian. He said that wasn't his brother. His brother didn't ride like that, didn't use a sword like that, and certainly didn't respond to others like that. He then asked who he really was. Callian had to keep himself in check. He had to remember that he was no longer the king of Secretia, the man who had lost his homeland to the mad king Planche. So he simply waited. He remained calm until he could obtain Sisvania's will. Afterward, he simply commented that Planche was saying strange things again. Even so, Planche continued suspecting him. Later, while discussing this with Ellen Manasil, the man commented that it made sense for Planche to notice something. Even if he was a scoundrel, he was not stupid. Callian replied that he had pretended not to understand what he meant, but Planche had clearly not believed it. Ellen Manasil then asked what they would need to do to convince everyone that he really was Callian. The prince replied that he was no one other than Callian himself, and he truly believed that. Even so, Ellen Manasil thought that no matter how much he said he would no longer live as Baron, it was impossible to completely forget an entire lifetime. Ellen Manasil then gave something to Callian. It was a magical communication ring. He explained that if the prince needed to talk to an old man at any time, he would hear him and offer his thoughts. He also warned that the ring didn't work inside places reached by Sisvania's power, so within the castle communication would be blocked, but outside of it, he would be able to respond normally. Callian thanked him and said he liked having that communication channel with him, but Ellen Manasil asked whether he was worried about being alone. After all the people around him were servants, people subordinate to him. They weren't exactly normal companions. Later, Commander Urin appeared to formally introduce himself. He led the Siegfried Knights and promised that his men would protect the prince until they reached Sisvania's nest, located in Siegfried's territory. Callian noticed that the knights were extremely professional. The problem was something else. Most of them clearly had an aggressive aura directed toward him, mainly because Jan, the young master of their family, had abandoned his position to stay by the prince's side. Shortly after, Jan himself appeared saying that it was already time to leave and asked whether Callian needed anything before the journey. The knights watched the scene with an almost murderous look, and it was precisely at that moment that Callian, in front of all of them, asked Jan to fetch him something to drink. Water, tea, anything would do. Jan went without complaint. Callian then turned to the knights with a small smile on his face, and they grew even more irritated. Watching all of this, Ellen Manasil could only think about how that boy seemed to multiply his own enemies for no reason. Sometime later, Callian finally arrived before the opportunity he had been waiting for, to witness Sisvania's will. He proceeded escorted by the knights and his servants, while Planche simply observed everything from a distance. Salisi Bryson, this time, was quiet, causing no trouble, and Callian was glad she was staying staying that way. After one last look at his master, he entered the Rosalita ritual. Meanwhile, later on, Romain Laroon Caris was speaking with Ellen Manassil and asked whether it wouldn't be better to accompany the prince personally, but Ellen Manassil replied that he didn't need to worry. In truth, he was more concerned about his highness's safety inside the castle than outside it. The king replied that that definitely didn't sound like a compliment and asked whether he truly wasn't worried. Ellen Manassil thought that the king had been acting strangely indifferent for some time and replied that he hadn't said anything wrong. The king then commented that that was precisely the problem with Ellen Manassil. During the journey, Callian tried to use the ring to get in touch with his master, but since he was still in the castle, communication ended up being blocked. Even so, the prince continued talking to himself through the ring, commenting that he had heard there were deliveries arriving from Tensel and that the palace must be in absolute chaos. He then joked, saying that at least they could talk to avoid getting bored along the way. The knights who were observing all of this only grew more and more irritated. Earlier, before the departure, Yan had given very specific instructions to the knights. He said that Prince Callian was someone with no magical talent nor any real skill with a sword. According to him, the prince only knew a little self-defense, was extremely fragile, and needed to be protected like a delicate flower. But the knights could only think about how the young master of the Siegfried family had abandoned his position as heir to serve precisely that person. In the middle of the journey, however, something unexpected happened. The group was caught off guard by a presence emerging from the forest, but Callian immediately noticed it wasn't something truly dangerous. Who came out of the woods was a small elf. The elf introduced herself as Silas and explained that she was hiding because she was hungry. Callian asked if she had appeared just to get something to eat. The little elf quickly replied that she had been hiding and apologized for appearing like that. But Callian noticed there was something strange about that conversation. Commander Urin then asked what they should do. The prince replied that they would give food to the child, but at the same time he sensed another presence approaching. Someone was coming on horseback, carrying an extremely menacing aura. Uran immediately moved in front of the prince and demanded that the man identify himself. The stranger replied that he was pursuing a thief and asked whether they had seen a strange child around. Urin replied coldly that they hadn't seen anyone and told him to leave. But the man persisted. He said he didn't want to fight with knights. He was just looking for someone. Urin was about to repeat the order when Callian intervened and asked what the person he was looking for looked like. The man replied that it was a young elf. Callian then calmly said that he could check for himself. At that very instant, Silas was terrified. When the man advanced, Callian approached and whispered for him not to turn around and to just listen carefully. He explained that the people hiding nearby had no intention of protecting either him or the child. As soon as they confirmed the elf's identity, arrows would be fired. But the man made the mistake of looking back. The next instant, arrows flew toward him and the prince. But Callian reacted far too quickly. Using his skill with knives, he managed to deflect the arrows and even save the man. He then complained that he had warned him not to turn around. The knights immediately noticed the ambush and began protecting the prince. Uran reacted quickly and created a magical shield around Callian and the man he had saved. Meanwhile, Uran ordered his men to advance after the enemies. But Callian noticed that the arrows had stopped. The attackers were already fleeing. Kiri then said he would keep the elf under his protection for the time being, and that they could continue the journey with Prince Callian. But when Kiri approached, the man revealed his true intentions and tried to attack from behind. Even so, Callian reacted quickly enough to block the strike and counterattack using a magic bullet. The knights were completely confused. After all, how was the prince able to use magic like that? Shortly after, Jan appeared extremely irritated, complaining that Callian had almost gotten hurt again. He said he had been lucky things had ended well, but the knights noticed something Yan hadn't yet. That prince was definitely not a delicate flower. He was hiding something. After that, Callian approached the small elf and asked to talk properly, but the child began desperately saying that she knew nothing, that she hadn't done anything, and that it wasn't her who had stolen anything. Callian then called Arson Hertz over and asked him to properly organize everything the elf was saying, because she seemed to answer questions before they were even asked. Sometime later, Arson Hertz appeared nearly losing his mind from the sheer amount of detail he had gathered. He said he had brought a complete report. According to her, the child's true name was Silas, meaning spirit of suppressed words. The name had been given by the mother tree. She worked in the Ririska forest and traveled together with someone named Luca. He also explained that Silas had apparently stolen an important item from the men who had attacked them. During the pursuit, she ended up separated from Luca, and that was how she came across the prince's group. Furthermore, Arkenhertz explained that the reason Silas answered before questions were asked was simply because he did so naturally. Callian praised the report and said the work had been excellent. He then dismissed the mage. Even so, he knew very well that if they left Silas alone, the pursuers would come back after him. He therefore decided to keep him nearby during the journey. But the prince also knew they still had a long journey ahead and did not intend to get deeply involved in that problem. A more detailed investigation would be left to some lord of the region. Uran then informed him that around dinner time, they would already be close to Hale Latland's territory. But shortly after, he returned to the prince, bringing something worrying. According to the commander, they had found something suspicious among the captured man's belongings. It was poison. The poison Callian had once taken came to his mind as he spoke with the commander. He then said he needed to see that man personally. The man commented that he had thought he was just a precious young master from some wealthy family, but apparently that wasn't all there was to it. Callian then replied that he was right. After all, all, he was an even more precious son of a very wealthy family. Without beating around the bush, Callian got straight to the point and asked whether the man knew what he was holding, showing him the poison, but the man replied that everyone there had one of those. He thought it was something valuable, so he had taken a few. He didn't even know exactly what they were looking for. He also said he couldn't see their faces because of the masks. Even without discovering much, Callian noticed that the man didn't seem to be protecting those people out of loyalty or affection, so he asked what his problem was, and said he could resolve it if the man decided to cooperate. He reiterated that he was the son of a powerful family and had the means to help him. The man finally revealed that his wife was in Hansen village, and that those people knew about it. Callian then assured him he could keep the woman safe, and asked what exactly had been stolen. The man explained that it was a small transparent sphere, similar to a marble. He didn't know what it was, but he had heard that a Tensel priest would need to verify the object to confirm it. At that very moment, Callian suspected it might be a sacred relic. These relics were used by the priests of Tensel as substitutes for sacred power, which was why Tensel was desperately trying to gather as many as possible. So it made sense for all the commotion. Something extremely valuable and important had been stolen. But there was still one thing that didn't make sense to him. What did that poison have to do with any of it? The man then explained that that poison was used by the birds of Secretia. In the worst case scenario, when they failed a mission, they used it, and that poison was obtained through White Eagle. The man continued, saying he had only heard the title of one of them, the leader. People called that person Blue Ladybug, and at that point, Callian found the situation completely strange. His former father's bird was supposed to be in Karis, so why was it there? After all, he knew very well who Blue Ladybug was. Later, already during the night, it began raining hard as they finally arrived at Hale Latland's territory. At first, Callian even found that welcome, because the rain had prevented the group from continuing to advance since dinner time, but he was already no longer able to stand Count Hale Latland, lord of that territory. The man was a chatty drunkard who simply would not stop talking. Hale Latland kept saying it was an enormous honor to receive the prince there. He even commented that it seemed as though the sky itself had sent that rain to serve him. While listening to all of it, Callian could only think about how much that man talked. Along the way, Yan asked whether the prince didn't remember him. He explained that he was one of the men who had previously sent gifts. Callian replied that he did remember. He was even among the recipients who had received the gifts returned to them. Yan confirmed this and explained that he had originally been on Prince Randell Sale Karis's side, but had quickly switched to Planche's side 6 years ago, during the War of the Desert in Tensel. Upon hearing that, Callian realized that those men's interests had now completely shifted toward him. Meanwhile, Hale Latland kept talking without stopping. He said he had been eagerly awaiting the prince's arrival, and hadn't even been able to sleep from the excitement. Callian then thought that the servants in that place must suffer greatly. The territory's steward, Malcolm Chadish, clearly seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation, but before the conversation could continue, Arkin Hertz appeared, bringing urgent news for His Highness. He approached and whispered that they had captured the carrier pigeon. At that moment, Callian understood what that meant. Someone would try to warn Blue Ladybug that they were there, and in that rain, there was no other bird capable of flying that far. Even so, Hale Latland kept talking and offering the prince a drink, asking where he had been on such a cold day, and saying they should drink to warm up. But Callian ignored all of that, and asked directly whether there was a Tensel priest nearby. King Hale Latland was so nervous at the question that he spilled his own bottle. He said the prince must be drunk to say something like that, and began insulting the Tensel priests, saying those damned people would never set foot in his territory. But Callian lost his patience. He simply snapped his fingers and sent the man to sleep. Hale Latland immediately slumped with his head on the table. Callian then coldly commented that he could no longer tolerate the man's rude attitude. Later, already riding alongside the knights while communicating with his master, Alon Manasil asked whether he was saying that he had ended up getting mixed up with an item being sought by a secret agent, and that his life was now in danger. He then commented with irony that it was excellent news, but Callian replied that he was fine. Ellen Manasil then said that at that rate, he would soon retire and leave his disciple alone without a master. But Callian replied that he worried too much. After all, if it truly was the person he was thinking of, she wouldn't be someone all that dangerous. Even so, Ellen Manasil asked how far his connections extended. Callian then explained that that secret agent had never failed a mission before. There was no way she hadn't realized she was dealing with the Prince of Karis. After that, he asked a favor of his master. He wanted him to investigate the surroundings of Hale Latland and find out where the Tensel priest was staying. They needed to understand what that secret agent wanted with the priests. Later, Callian arrived at the meeting point. It was a dark, dimly lit tavern. As soon as he entered, he told the innkeeper that everything was fine and that the others had stayed outside. He had come alone. The woman replied that she wasn't cruel enough to harm people who had nothing to do with it. Callian then replied that she had attacked him knowing full well who he was, hadn't she? The innkeeper confirmed without hesitation. She said she knew exactly who he was and had even told him to keep quiet before. But at that instant, every other person inside the cave collapsed to the floor. They were corpses. The woman then coldly remarked that they had simply been too hasty, and that was why they ended up that way. Without showing any fear, Callian slowly approached the counter and asked whether he was now connected to the problem as well. She replied that she would say yes, but even before reaching for the knife, she noticed Callian was already watching her every move. She hesitated and commented that it would truly not be easy to catch him off guard. The first thing she said was that, had she known all of this would turn into such a headache, she would never have pursued that small elf. She explained that she personally didn't like the whole situation, but asked why the prince simply didn't go home after having caused so many problems. That way he would leave the child in peace and everyone would come out ahead. But Callian replied that she was being rude to a visitor. After all, he had traveled so far to get there, so she could at least answer one question. He then wanted to know why she was looking for a sacred relic. He said she clearly didn't look like a priestess. The woman simply replied that relics had been getting very expensive lately and that her usual line of work didn't pay quite so well. Callian then asked whether the buyer was in Hale Latlan. After all, it made no sense to sell something of that value in such a remote place. It would be far easier to find priests in Caris. Blue Ladybug replied that there was no one paying more than that buyer. She also mentioned that it was someone with whom she had an old connection. At that moment, Callian understood the link. There was only one type of relationship a Secretia secret agent would maintain in that way. It was someone selling information from the capital, and now, as payment for that information, they were buying sacred relics. Callian then said he would ask only one more question before leaving. Meanwhile, the king was buried in a pile of paperwork when Ellen Manasil came to visit. The king, Roman Larun Kairis, asked whether he was now being treated as an informant, but Ellen Manasil calmly replied that he had only come because he knew the king would still be awake. There was no reason to waste time investigating something when he could ask directly someone who knew the situation so well. He then asked how many Tinsel priests were in Caris and where they were. Roman Larun Kairis replied that he wasn't sure exactly how much Ellen Manasil already knew, nor whether that question came from prior information or was merely a coincidence. Even so, he explained that the representatives of Tensil had gone to the capital specifically because of this. He said that among the 14 priests present in Caris, aside from the one at the palace, Tensil wanted to find all the others and take them away so they wouldn't need to ask for help anymore. And after finally having sent the priests out for what they had wanted for so long, the king admitted it was uncomfortable to see Tensil acting as if Caris had been keeping those men held by force. Upon hearing that, Ellen Manasil realized that the situation in Tensil must be truly dire. They clearly didn't want to reveal what was happening, but they desperately needed the priests. So he asked what his majesty had done. The king replied that he didn't control the priests. He had only told the Tensil representatives to find the men themselves and take them if they wished. After that, he asked why Ellen Manasil wanted to know all of that. He then replied that Prince Callian wanted to discover their whereabouts. At that moment, Romain Larun Caris found the whole thing completely strange. There was no reason for Callian to want to know where the priests were, especially since he had apparently already arrived at precisely the location where they were hiding. Meanwhile, on the other side, Callian asked his last question to Blue Ladybug. He wanted to know whether the buyer of the sacred relic was Count Hale Latlan. She replied only with a who knows. She said that wasn't such a simple question to answer. Shortly after, while riding quickly on his way back, Callian received a message from Ellen Manasil. His master explained that Hale Latlan had pretended to know nothing, had hidden the priest he had, and had acted as if there were no priest in his home. Callian then replied that he already knew that, and said he was returning immediately to the castle. Just by the tone of his voice, Ellen Manasil sensed the urgency of the situation, and asked whether something had happened. Callian then explained that when he had put Hale Latlan to sleep with magic, he had noticed something strange. The man had not been truly drunk. Meanwhile, Jan was having to stall Malcolm Chadish, the steward of Hale Latlan. He said the prince had gone out for a walk, but Malcolm Chadish replied that he only needed a brief word with his highness. He explained that the count wished to apologize for the unpleasant attitude during dinner. Jan then asked whether he was trying to cover up for his master's insolence. He also questioned since when a count's steward had the right to interrogate the whereabouts of a prince. At that moment, Malcolm Chadish was embarrassed, but inwardly, Jan was also worried, because Callian had not yet returned. Even so, the steward persisted and asked whether he could at least know when the prince would be back. Jan then thought irritably that that old man was far too persistent. But at that very instant, Callian himself came out of the room complaining that he couldn't even rest in peace. He then called Jan incompetent, saying he should just make up a decent excuse and send everyone away, because it didn't seem that difficult. Jan immediately apologized and explained that that old man had been insisting too much. Shortly after, he shut the door in Malcolm Chadish's face. Outside, the steward quickly apologized, saying he hadn't known his highness was resting, and that he would take his leave immediately. Watching all of that, Callian thought with relief that he had made it back in time, and at that moment, he realized he had ended up acting exactly like a certain person. He had been just like Planche, and that left a bad taste in Callian's mouth. Good grief. Jan then replied that he had returned faster than expected, and on top of that through the window. What a mess he had made. Callian said it was a long story, but then asked whether anyone had come looking for him. Were they already suspicious? Jan replied that only that steward had come looking, but also commented that it wasn't every day he saw a prince jumping through windows like that. At the time, he had been in a complete panic. Even so, Callian asked why he seemed so angry. He didn't act that way at the palace. Jan then explained that that steward simply wouldn't listen. First, he had said the prince had gone for a walk, but the man kept insisting on knowing when he would return. He even seemed far more interested in the time of his return than in finding out where he had gone. After that, Callian relayed all of that information to Ellen Manasil. The count was clearly standing guard and was probably investigating his movements, and in the end, the prince realized he had been right. Hale Latlan had not been drunk at that time. Ellen Manasil then asked whether he had already managed to connect some pieces of the investigation. The prince replied that the exchange of sacred relics with Blue Ladybug was supposed to take place on that very day, which explained why she was there. The wine would have been nothing more than a convenient excuse for the count to leave without raising suspicion, but the plan had been ruined because Callian had put him to sleep with an enchantment. Afterward, when he discovered that the prince had left the castle, he had sent the steward to investigate his intentions. Ellen Manasiel replied that it made perfect sense, but asked why he would be so desperate for a sacred relic. Callian then explained that he was probably trying to use those relics to get on the good side of Contentio, the homeland of Randell Sale Karis's mother. Upon hearing that, Ellen Manasila commented that while maintaining a good relationship with Randell Sale Kairis, the man was also flirting with Plancha's side and secretly sending gifts to Callian. On top of that, he was selling information about Kairis to a secret agent of Secretia. He truly was very cunning. The prince already knew that helping Silas, who was being pursued, had only been the beginning. The man who had been chasing the elf revealed the name of Blue Ladybug, and he had also discovered that Hale Latlin was sending sacred relics to Tensal simply to curry favor with Randall Sale Karis. If all of that together was not a coincidence, then the Count was involved far more deeply than he appeared. Callian then commented that the rain would not stop until the following day. Since he was stuck inside, he would deal with the traitor himself. Meanwhile, Hale Latlin was having a complete breakdown. He smashed cups as he complained that audacious brat must have realized he would be a problem the moment he returned those gifts. The prince had clearly used an enchantment at dinner, because only magic would explain such a heavy sleep like that. Now his plans were completely ruined because of Callian. Furious, he also cursed Selesh Brisson, saying that stupid wench should have killed Callian before all that mess began. He had worked hard to win over the nobles, spent a fortune on gifts, and done everything to maintain his influence. Shortly after, Malcolm Chadish returned, saying he still hadn't managed to make contact with Blue Ladybug, but they might receive a response later. But Hale Latlin replied by hurling a cup at his face and shouting that he never did anything right. Outside, it was still raining, which meant the half-blood would spend another night inside that castle. Malcolm Chadish then asked whether they should postpone the transaction. The Count replied that they didn't have much choice. He couldn't take risks while the prince and his men were still there. After that, he took out his frustration on the maids as well, bellowing that damned half-blood would pay for everything. Later, everyone had gathered for a meal. During dinner, Hale Latlin was discreetly staring at Callian, thinking that the damned prince was acting as if nothing had happened. But in Karis, the title of Count demanded respect, and the nobility would not stand idle if it were discovered that magic had been used against him. In his mind, that foolish prince's royal blood would not be enough to protect him. Sooner or later, he would be on his knees begging for forgiveness. Even so, he first resolved to apologize for his conduct the previous night. Callian replied calmly that it was fine. The Count then asked directly whether he had used an enchantment. The prince confirmed it without even hiding. He said he had put him to sleep because he had already become unbearable. He also told him not to worry so much. It must have been his first time receiving someone from the royal family, so it was understandable he had made that kind of mistake. He was probably nervous. Inwardly, Hale Latlin grew even more furious. He thought that cunning little ferret truly believed he could put all the blame on him. Shortly after, Callian casually remarked that he was tired of investigating the person responsible for the attack against him, but that they had ended up discovering a very interesting piece of information. It was about the name of a bird. At that very moment, Hale Latlin even spat out the wine he was drinking. Malcolm Chadish ran to help him, while Callian didn't even bother hiding that he had expected exactly that reaction. He then continued, saying that they would still need to investigate further, but imagine the Count would also have an interest in discovering what was happening within his own territory. Trying to maintain his composure, Hale Latlin replied that he would do everything within his power to help. After all, a prince being attacked on his lands was something he could never permit. At that moment, Euron approached Callian to whisper something in his ear. Meanwhile, the Count was thinking he could no longer keep watching that pompous prince act that way. He needed to expel him from the territory as quickly as possible. But then Callian looked at him and said it was truly unfortunate for the Count, because it appeared that someone wanted to speak with him. Shortly after, Hale Latlin accompanied Euron, Yan, and the prince to a dirty and unpleasant place, asking along the way how they intended to bring that person there. Callian knew exactly what the man was thinking. The Count was already extremely agitated and practically holding himself back from doing something foolish, but the prince had also already prepared the perfect bait for him. The previous night, he had spoken with the man who had tried to attack him. The man immediately asked whether something had happened to his wife. Callian then replied that his family would not be harmed. He gave his word. The man explained that at that point, he knew very well he would be executed. After all, he had attempted on the life of a prince. As soon as the investigation concluded, he would be taken to Karis and hanged. And even if, by some miracle, his life was spared, he still wouldn't receive proper care. His arm would end up necrotizing, and in the end he would die the same way. The man asked what exactly Callian meant by that. The prince then explained that he would like to offer him a way out, a life far from that territory, a plot of land to cultivate, and a home where he could live in peace beside his wife. But that would only happen in exchange for his help. With his cooperation, the sentence could be reduced. Instead of execution, he would only suffer the amputation of his arm, which was already going to necrotize anyway. Faced with that, the man accepted the proposal and asked what he needed to do. When Hale Latlin arrived at the location, the first thing he heard was the man saying that the person known as Blue Ladybug was a Secretia secret agent. She would be negotiating certain goods for her client, and apparently Apparently the two had been meeting for quite some time. The man also commented that this was strange, because relationships with secret agents rarely lasted that long. Callian then replied that it truly was strange, unless of course there was a double agent in the mix. A traitor, someone secretly selling information. He then asked directly whether Hale Latland didn't agree with that. The Count replied with a forced laugh, clearly nervous. He kept repeating ha 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 as he agreed in an uncomfortable manner. At that moment, Callian noticed that he was already desperate. It was the perfect time to make his move. Later, Malcolm Chittish appeared begging for mercy. He implored the prince, saying that everything he had done was simply follow his master's orders. He knew he wasn't innocent, but even so he pleaded for Callian's compassion. The prince listened to all of that without showing much reaction. He then asked whether Malcolm Chittish wasn't the Tencel priest. If he were, he was probably the one buying and reselling the sacred relics. Moreover, the reason for acting in such a submissive manner toward the Count was likely because Hale Latland had discovered his secret. Desperate, Malcolm Chittish admitted that if Tencel found out he had been selling sacred relics, they would take his head before he could even return home. But that ended up becoming a great twist. Even Callian himself hadn't expected to discover that he was reselling the relics, and in his desperation, Malcolm Chittish ended up revealing something even greater. He said he had sold relics to the older brother of Queen Selace Breeson, Viscount Renan Breeson, and that the man was using those sacred relics to give gifts to Tencel. So here is what happened. Renan Breeson established a connection with Tencel, which meant he had betrayed Plancha and taken Randel's side. This also meant he had turned his back on the Breeson family itself, on Selace, and on everyone who wished to see Plancha as crown prince. Callian managed to set a perfect trap and ended up getting something far better than he had hoped for with the bait he prepared. Through the communication ring, Ellen asked what he intended to do now, because that would certainly cause a great uproar. The best course of action would be to discuss everything with Romaine first. Callian agreed, but before that he asked Ellen to write a letter to Count Hale Latland. Later, Callian summoned Urin and Jan and ordered them to take care of the man imprisoned in the basement. His arm was in serious condition, and since they had taken too long to treat the wound, amputation would likely be the only option. He then ordered them to give the drug in his hand to the prisoner, and Urin immediately replied that he would do so. Next, Callian asked Kiri to go to Hanson Village, find that man's wife, and bring her to a safe place. At that moment, Silas opened the door, saying that Hina had come to clean the room, and that she had decided to accompany her. She also asked them, please, not to scold her. Callian said nothing, and simply thought that was Arksan's problem, not his. Shortly after, Silas stopped to play with a carrier pigeon that was inside a cage. Yan asked what His Highness intended to do with the bird and whether he planned to take it along. Callian replied that no, he would return it to its rightful owner. He noticed that Hina had also grown quite fond of the pigeon, and promised he would give her a bird as a gift when they returned to the palace. Unfortunately, that particular one would have to be returned today. Hina then remarked that Marilyn probably would not enjoy having a bird inside her room. Callian then suggested they help release the pigeon after dinner. He also reminded them to leave the window wide open, because someone was expected that night. Later, the visitor truly appeared through the balcony. Callian remarked that the person had arrived earlier than he expected. The woman known as Blue Ladybug replied that she had been moved by the contents of the letter. It stated that, unless she wished her actions to be reported to the White Eagle, she was to meet with the prince. She then asked why she was being threatened in such a manner. Callian explained that they had already confirmed evidence that King Olaton was negotiating sacred relics and selling information. He also said that if she handed over the relics, her secret would remain kept. The woman was silent for a few seconds, and Callian asked if that was her answer. Unfortunately, she confirmed that it was. She said she hated complicated relationships, and in the next instant, fired several magic bullets at him. Callian managed to block the attack using his magic shield, but found it strange, because in the past she fought with a sword. The explosion drew the attention of the castle's servants, but he locked the door with magic, and ordered no one to enter. He then asked if she had really come there with the intention of killing him, and if there was anything else she would like to say. She replied no, and immediately advanced, closing the distance to strike her sword against his. Callian knew that the ordinary iron sword he carried would not withstand his opponent's aura for long. He needed to end the fight quickly without revealing his own aura. Using his ability, he disarmed her rapidly, but she had anticipated that. The woman was hiding one last magic bullet. He realized he would not be able to block the shot without using aura, so he ended up channeling power into the sword. Even so, the blade snapped in two. Surprised, Blue Ladybug asked if he was a master swordsman. At that moment, Callian decided to call her by her real name, Isla. She was completely stunned and motionless, allowing him to approach and hold her face. When he checked her mouth, he found the poison was not there. All secret agents of Baron Secretia were supposed to carry hidden suicide poison in case of capture. He then asked what she truly knew. Isla asked if he intended to let her leave alive after all that. Callian replied that he had always heard that Secretians were extremely resolute, but apparently that was not the case with her. He said he did not know whether she had always been that way or had changed over time. She then remarked that perhaps it would be better to let her go. After all, the fact that a master swordsman carried a sword worse than his own guards made it obvious he was hiding his abilities. If he did not want to be found out, he had better let her go, because because otherwise she would tell the knights everything she had witnessed there. In the other timeline, the blue ladybug had been completely loyal to Baron Secretia, a true master swordswoman devoted to her own blade. Because of this, Callian ended up feeling disappointed. He grabbed her by the collar and warned that, if she wanted to stay alive, she should not take that story too far. He also said she should not have faced death before him. Even so, he managed to control himself and released her shortly after. He said it was not a secret significant enough to be worth her life. He then simply demanded the evidence. He also explained that he had no intention of interrogating her himself, because the White Eagle would be the one to do that. Meanwhile, Count Hale Latland still had not received any word from Malcolm. Furious, he wondered what was happening and what kind of absurd letter he had just received. The message stated that the dear Count needed someone to represent him. It also stated that everything he had sold during that time had already been explained to Queen Selesay, so he need not worry about anything further. The letter was signed by Ellen Manasil. The Count grew furious upon realizing that even the sacred relics had been discovered. He called the mage cunning and complained about the situation. He said it was irritating to have to bow before that wretched commoner prince, and imagined they must have thought he would come running, trembling with fear. Even so, he declared they should not underestimate him. He then opened the enormous vault full of treasures and walked toward a far more valuable box. Inside it was a small chest filled with sacred relics. He remarked that he would earn a fortune with those items, and decided to take everything to trade and flee from there. However, Arsene, who had been invisible behind him the entire time, took the chest first. The Count immediately asked if that was invisibility magic. Arsene then introduced himself as Arsene Hertz, mage of Prince Callian, and thanked him for having gathered all the evidence with his own hands. Finally, Arsene told the king not to worry, as he would perfectly relay his message to the wretched cunning mage and the wretched commoner prince. Later, Arsene personally delivered the sacred relics to Prince Callian. Along with them, he also brought all the documents related to the leaked information from Karis and the king's illegal relic trade. Callian replied that Arsene had done excellent work, and that thanks to him, all that mess was finally concluded. Shortly after, however, Yan appeared saying there was something important the prince needed to see outside the estate. When they went out, they found the king's personal cavalry stationed there. Those knights were supposed to be protecting the king in Karis, but they were in that territory now. Meanwhile, upon learning what had happened, Elan questioned Romain, asking why he had sent his own personal cavalry to that place. He said they should have sent the royal knights, and complained that the moment he stepped away for an instant, he went and did something like that. Romain replied that in an incident involving the Brisson family, they could not send soldiers who might be their spies. He said he only trusted those worthy of being his sword. Even so, Elan asked why he was treating Prince Callian in such a special manner. That could end up putting the king in ruin. The moment people started thinking Callian was being favored, his life would be in danger. He also reminded him that the king had never shown special interest in any of his sons, precisely to avoid that kind of situation. Romain replied that something like this could not happen again. Because of that, the following day he would have lunch with the other two princes to better understand the state of their relationship. Elan then replied that that would be valuable time for his majesty. Meanwhile, Malcolm asked if the prince was truly leaving. Callian replied that he was. He explained that Kayla, the king's personal guard, would handle the rest, and that all the criminals would be taken to the capital. However, unfortunately, one of them had died before even being transported. A true shame. In reality, Norton, the man who had lost his arm, was officially declared dead and safely escorted out of the castle. At that moment, he was likely already crossing the Whitling territory together with his wife. Callian then told the worried Malcolm that no matter how loyal he was to the king, he should be aware of the grave crimes he was involved in, especially regarding the sale of sacred relics. Malcolm admitted he had made a mistake. Even so, Callian stated that he had been very useful in capturing the true culprit, and therefore asked for a degree of leniency regarding his punishment. But he made it clear that from then on, he expected absolute loyalty. Malcolm replied immediately that he understood completely, but was caught off guard when Callian announced that he would now be the new administrative agent of Latlan. Unable to believe what he had heard, he asked if that was truly serious. Later, the journey toward the nest of Sisfania finally resumed. Along the way, Callian heard several pieces of news. Hale had lost his noble title and would spend the rest of his life in prison. In addition, Isla's sentence had already been carried out. Meanwhile, during lunch among the princes, Randell remarked to his brother that the plaza was covered with Lenacita leaves. These leaves resembled ordinary tree leaves, but were in fact enormous thorns of the Lenacita cactus, capable of intensely absorbing all the moisture around them. Because of this, when a plaza became covered with Lenacita leaves, the ground remained dry and clean even after a public execution. So when someone said the plaza was full of those leaves, it normally meant someone had been executed there. Randall said it merely to plant doubt in Planche's mind, trying to make him believe that Queen Selesay had been executed. However, Planche immediately replied that his brother was wrong. Randall then remarked that he had heard that, after Callian's departure, Planche had stopped drinking alcohol. Planche asked if he missed the smell of liquor. The first prince replied that he certainly did not, and suggested the two spend the rest of that moment in silence. Even with his body still full of aches, Planche asked how silent exactly he wanted it to be. Meanwhile, on the road to the nest of Sisfania, Callian and the knights found the path completely blocked by an enormous landslide caused by the rain. They realized it would be much faster to go around the area than to clear all the earth and stones from the road. Irritated, Callian thought that first they had to remain in Latland because of the rain, and now they would need to make a huge huge detour because of a landslide. This journey seemed like it would never end. He then muttered to himself that as soon as he reached the capital, he would create a teleportation device for the love of God. At that moment, Silas remarked that this was a wonderful opportunity to visit the elf village. She said Luca was there, along with the elders, so the prince could rest there. Callian replied that was probably the best thing Silas had said since joining the group. After giving him a few flicks on the head for acting like a foolish elf, they genuinely decided to head to the elf village. As soon as they entered the forest, everyone was left in awe of the landscape. The place was so incredible that even Callian himself had never seen anything like it, not even when he was still barren. When they arrived at the village, one of the older elves greeted them and asked which of them was the king of the human clan. Callian replied that he was nothing so impressive, merely the representative of the group. The elf then introduced himself as Zera of Heriska village, and said he had a favor to ask of the king of humans. Callian immediately corrected him, saying he was not a king, but Callian Reincarnated. Even so, he asked if Zera was really requesting help from someone he did not even know. Zera explained that some time ago, some elves had gone to a nearby human village but had disappeared more than 10 days ago. Afterward, they sent 2 others to look for them, but those 2 never returned either. He then asked the prince to find the missing ones, because the elves did not know the human world well enough to keep sending more people. As he listened, Callian thought the elf was insistent and somewhat self-centered. He also wondered if all elves were like that, because the ones he knew were usually not that way. He then asked why exactly he should help them. Zera replied that it was because he was the king of the human clan. Once again, Callian corrected him, saying it was not a clan but a kingdom called Karis, and that he was not a king but a prince. He explained that those words had completely different meanings. Zera then said that in that case, he was not asking for help solely because of that. He asked whether they were heading towards Siegfried's territory, and explained that human roads were slow, but that using the forest routes they could drastically reduce their travel time. Callian calculated how much time they would lose doing that, and also how long it would take to get there. He then asked if 5 elves had truly disappeared. If that was the case, it was obvious he would help, and so the prince set off together with the knights. Along the way, Euron remarked that there was still no evidence of slave trafficking as his highness had suspected. The forest lay between 2 villages, Narika and Sting. There were some men with the appearance of mercenaries in the area, but they did not appear to be committing any crimes there. This put Carrie somewhat at ease, because the first thing he thought of upon hearing about missing elves was precisely human trafficking. The prince then decided to follow the original plan, and first sweep the nearby villages. Euron explained that continuing along that road would bring them to Sting. Both regions were of similar size and comparable strength, so there was enormous rivalry between them, especially since the 2 lords were close in age and competed constantly. Callian remarked that in reality, that actually worked out well for the area's development. He also took the opportunity to say he needed to buy a new sword, since his had broken. But when they arrived at the forge, the blacksmith replied that he had no swords to sell. Confused, Callian asked how a shop full of weapons could have no swords available. The shopkeeper then asked if he was a mercenary, saying he seemed too young. Callian replied that he was a mage, and that the man beside him was the swordsman. The shopkeeper explained that it was not ordinary mercenaries who were buying the weapons. According to him, numerous mercenaries were being secretly gathered inside the castle, and so all the weapons produced by the forge were going directly there. He added that if they were looking for mercenary work, they should go to the castle, but Callian replied that he did not want work, he just needed a weapon immediately. He then asked whether the situation in the neighboring village of Narika was different. The blacksmith said no. The situation there was exactly the same. It was at that moment that Callian finally understood what the elder had done to him. If both lords were buying weapons and gathering mercenaries, it was obvious they were preparing for war, and the elf village was right in the middle of the 2 territories that were about to come into conflict. The elder had not sent him there merely to find missing elves. In reality, he wanted him to resolve the entire mess. Later, Callian returned to the elf village carrying 2 letters for Elder Zera. He asked that one be sent to Sting and the other to Narika. He also said that, on the date set for the meeting between the lords, the 5 missing elves would return home. After that, he announced he would leave the place the following morning, and asked them to prepare the forest path. Confused, Zera asked if that meant there would truly be a war. Only then did he realize he had said too much. Callian replied that he had assumed that, being an elf, the elder would think it unlikely that he would see through the truth. Even so, he had deliberately deceived him while knowing full well that a war was underway. He also remarked that the 5 elves had likely gone to work as mercenaries to earn money, and were waiting inside Sting's castle for the conflict to begin. It made no sense that the elves would know about the war, and yet the elder would not. If even he, a prince, upon discovering something like that within his own kingdom, would try to prevent the conflict, it was obvious he had been sent there for exactly that purpose. Zera was left completely speechless. Callian then continued, saying he no longer needed the forest's secret path or any other help. Their agreement ended there. The elder asked if he truly did not care that a war was happening within his own kingdom. Callian replied that both sides were fighting for a reason, and that it would eventually come to an end. He also said that if that place was so important to the elder, then he should protect it himself instead of relying on cheap tricks to manipulate others. This time, Zera did not even try to argue back. He simply remained silent inside the office. Later, Carrie informed the prince that the root cause of the entire situation was the Breezen Empire. It was the only empire in the region, and after the incident in the Latland on territory, they had halted local trade. Callian remarked, irritated, that the problem always came back to the name Brisson. They then explained the whole situation. Both Sting and Nerica had land unsuitable for farming, so they were entirely dependent on wheat imported from the Brisson Empire. However, when the Empire halted trade without warning, Sting attempted to buy wheat from Nerica. The problem was that Nerica charged an absurd price, and that ended up pushing both territories to the brink of war. Callian also disliked the way they monopolized food like that. In the end, the ones who truly suffered were not the lords but the common citizens who went hungry. The conversation, however, was interrupted by knocking at the door. It was Zera. The elder asked for forgiveness for what he had done. He admitted he had known from the beginning that the prince was involved in that incident because of Luca. He also explained that the origin of the war was tied to that very incident, and so he believed the fault was his. He then revealed that Luca was his son. Furthermore, he confessed that the boy was involved in the disappearance of the elves, so he had assumed that if the prince knew the full situation, he would end up helping. That was precisely why he had hidden part of the truth. He asked for forgiveness once more, and knowing it was selfish of him, he begged for the prince's help. But Callian cut him off before he could continue. He told him to meet with the lords, deliver the letters, and find out what else they needed beyond wheat. After that, they would also meet. Unable to believe it, Zera asked if he truly intended to help them. Callian replied that he was not doing it for the elves, so the elder had better not deceive himself. Even so, Zera expressed deep gratitude. He said elves valued promises above all else, and would never forget the help they received. Later, alone again, Callian returned to thinking about Renan Brisson, the man who kept interfering with his plans. He then used the communication ring to contact his master and said it was about time they got rid of him. The following morning, at the Brisson estate, Evan Brisson, the patriarch of the family, was preparing to receive an important guest. The servants found it strange, because Evan normally participated in central nobility meetings and almost never received visitors in the main hall, especially without prior notice. But the visitor was precisely the man who never announced when he would arrive, Ellen Manisil. When he received him, Evan remarked that if he had given notice beforehand, he would have prepared something special for his arrival. Ellen replied that he had imagined Evan would need to make many preparations before that conversation, but in the end he had simply come to give a testimony. He then revealed that his second son had been watching the first son of His Majesty. Evan appeared interested in the subject but said Renan did not have enough ability to do something so significant. Ellen replied that he was being too critical of his own son, but perhaps it would be better to trust the evidence rather than his own judgment. He then handed over several documents. When Evan finished reading everything, he asked what exactly Elon was trying to imply. Elon replied that he should think about what he would do with Renan from that point forward. Evan shot back that this was not a matter for a mere mage to interfere in, but Ellen replied immediately that a mere swordsman should not be saying that to him. In that instant, Evan aggressively released his aura, indignant at the audacity of someone speaking to him in such a manner. Swordsmen carried killing intent and aura, but mages carried something different. They mastered the logic of mana and true fear, that deep terror connected to death, hidden in the depths of people's hearts. And Evan was completely crushed by Elon's presence. The dread emitted by an 8th class mage was suffocating. Even so, Elon calmly asked that they speak as two civilized men. After a while, Evan managed to regain his composure. Meanwhile, Ellen thought that the man had truly endured considerable pressure. He was definitely not just a simple master swordsman. He then said he trusted Evan would resolve the situation with his own son, but wished to suggest a more efficient solution. At that point, Ellen began repeating exactly what Callian had told him to say. He suggested that Renan Brisson be expelled from the family, and that they show interest in selling the Emporium. According to Callian, there were rumors that Selasi had poisoned part of the trade, and as a result, the Emporium had suffered enormous losses. The only reason it was still standing was that it generated too much money. But the Brisson family was a family of knights. Renan had only created the Emporium because he had no talent for fencing, and Evan Brisson had probably been thinking for a long time about getting rid of that business, which was no longer as profitable and still tarnished the family's name. Even so, Evan asked why he would do something that would end up benefiting the third prince. Elon replied that he had expected that question, but explained that it would not be Callian who would buy the Emporium. Evan then asked if he had someone else in mind. Elon confirmed that he did. He said the buyer would be the person who managed the second largest Emporium in Karis. Evan could invent a convincing excuse for the sale and still get an excellent price, because Melfer Paloon would buy everything immediately. Meanwhile, Renan was tending to his beloved little plants. Ever since he heard about King Olaton's imprisonment, he had been extremely anxious, and only his plants could calm him somewhat. He was worried about the possibility of needing to sell everything and flee to Tensil if his connection to the king were discovered. Fortunately, he had cut off all contact before that could happen. At that moment, Renan was so stressed that he accidentally clipped a tiny piece off one of his plant's leaves. He then stared at it with an absurd degree of sadness. He tried to reassure himself by thinking that he still had some trade agreements in other territories, though none of them were important enough to be cause for concern. But before he could even turn around, a knight grabbed him from behind. After that, a rumor began to circulate throughout all of Karis. It was said that a large quantity of sacred relics had been transferred to Tensil, and that the one who had helped was Renan Brisson. Then, suddenly, Renan disappeared completely. Even with Marquis Brisson using every possible method to investigate, no one could find any trace of him. Of course, Evan first suspected Ellen and Melfer Paloon, but in the end confirmed that the two two apparently had no connection whatsoever to the disappearance. Later, Ellen contacted Callian through the communication ring and reported that they were successfully taking over the Emporium through Melfer Poloon. He also asked them to send the items to the region as quickly as possible and told them to get in touch if anything was needed. At that moment, Zara approached and asked if all preparations were complete. He explained that he had already sent the request to the Mother Tree and that they would soon be able to leave through the forest path. He then asked if his son Luca could guide them, but Callian replied he would prefer it to be Cialis. He then asked if she would be able to guide them through the forest. She replied that yes, she could. Callian also asked if she was certain, since she would need to return alone afterward, but Cialis told him not to worry. She said she could cross that path with her eyes closed. It was then that Callian noticed something strange. He was conversing normally with Cialis, as if she understood his language perfectly. She asked if something was wrong. She then showed her a stone covered in strange runes. At once, Callian asked if Luca had stolen that, along with the sacred relics. Luca replied that he did not know, and that he did not even remember clearly, but Arson asked if that too could be a sacred relic. After all, the black stone had been found alongside several other similar objects when Luca returned to the village. Yurin then remarked that it seemed far too dangerous to be an ordinary relic. The smell of blood coming from the stone was too strong. Callian immediately agreed. Arkson could not sense it, but that stone carried an extremely menacing aura. It possessed an energy connected to life and blood forcibly torn away. In other words, the stone's original owner had likely been murdered. That needed to be investigated. Even so, Callian told Cialis to use the stone for now, since they would need to communicate during the journey through the forest. Cialis asked if it did not belong to Luca, but Callian replied that it was now his. Poor Luca simply stayed quiet in the corner. Cialis then said she would hold onto the stone and return it when they reached the other side of the forest. As she stepped away, Yoron approached Callian to talk about the girl. According to him, the fact that she answered questions before they were even asked indicated she could see the future. But Callian replied that from what he had heard, those were not exactly predictions. Even so, he agreed with Yoron. It seemed like the future arrived a little faster for her than for other people. He had seen something similar before. The future, temporal distortion, the stone that nullified abilities related to time. Perhaps everything was connected to the time axis. Meanwhile, Randell continued to dwell on his brother's words, in which Callian had said the roses would bloom again soon. He realized that Callian had truly managed to get rid of Renon this time, but Randell also possessed a sacred relic, so he used the power of the relic to make the rose bloom once more. He gazed at it in silence, saying it was still beautiful to behold, and asked it to remain that way for a little longer. Later, during the journey, when they stopped to rest for the night, Callian began to meditate in order to concentrate his mana. It was then that Ellen congratulated him, saying it was remarkable. He had not gained an additional circle, but his aura was far stronger. However, Callian immediately replied, asking him to stop making fun of him. The mage explained that, even if only for a moment, it would not be easy to abandon the habit of wielding a sword. That was why his mana did not convert into magic circles normally, but ended up becoming aura instead. Callian replied that he understood that, but still found it strange how the principles behind aura and magic circles seemed entirely different. He had enough mana, so he could not understand why. Subconsciously, it always ended up turning into aura. Ellen replied only that he should not return to Karis until he had found that answer. Perhaps he would find it, perhaps not, but either way he was following his own path. He said Callian needed to trust in that. After all, every path leads somewhere, does it not? The next morning, they finally reached the end of the forest trail. They were now in elephant territory, the Duchy of Siegfried. Cialis then remarked that this was the moment to say goodbye. She said she could return the stone now, but Callian, out of courtesy, asked whether she truly needed to go back to the village. Cialis's reaction upon hearing that was immediate. She was visibly elated when she realized he wanted to bring her along as a guide in Luca's place. Even Callian himself noticed that. For a moment, she had thought she would be left behind. He then remarked that perhaps she could seek out Sisfania's will and ask about him as well. He then asked directly whether she wanted to continue traveling with them. Before he even finished the question, Cialis replied yes. She explained that sometimes people in the village felt uncomfortable around her, but the Mother Tree always said that was part of who she was, and that being different was not something bad. Even if she spoke in strange ways, she was still an elf. Callian replied that she was right. He then took the stone back and told her to be very happy from then on. Cialis thanked him once more for having saved her. The farewell ended up being quite emotional. Arkson clearly did not want to be separated from the little elf, but there was no other choice. The determination to protect Sisfania's land could be felt even in the massive walls of Siegfried's castle. As they approached the enormous stone guardians at the entrance, someone remarked that everyone should probably be grateful that Siegfried had no desire for the throne, because if he did, perhaps no one would be able to stop him. As they advanced, Callian asked Yan to stop acting like a simple servant once they entered his territory. He said that if those knights were already irritating, then the people of his lands would be even worse. But Yan replied that he could handle it on his own. Hearing that, Callian ended up remembering the many times he had said the exact same thing to Yan, when he cut his hair, when he grabbed the knife that flew toward him, when he was poisoned. Callian then sincerely apologized for all of it. After finally managing to take a good hot bath, Callian remarked that he had thought they had already arrived at Siegfried, but no, they had merely crossed the outer walls. It would still take about 2 days to reach the inner castle. He even asked what kind of castle was the size of an entire city, but complaining would change change nothing, so he used the time to better investigate that mysterious stone. While analyzing the object, he thought that Silas was truly a very different kind of elf, and then he realized he was too. Even if his mana converted into aura, that did not change his origin. Until then, he had always believed he was different from others, but perhaps the answer lay precisely in that. If he could not abandon the habit of converting mana into aura, then perhaps he could simply create magic circles using aura. With that thought, he began to meditate deeply and concentrated all of his power. On the other side of the door, Arkson watched everything, astonished. Kallian's energy was completely different from ordinary mana. Normally, mana was warm and gentle, but his was cold, aggressive, and gave one chills. Arkson had no idea of the true extent of the prince's capabilities. And then, in that moment, Kallian finally reached the fourth magic circle. That problem had been resolved. But another problem still remained, including Kallian himself, who was hiding his true identity. There were only 6 other master swordsmen on the entire continent. Masters could perceive the aura of those weaker than them, and Slyman, who was receiving his highness at that moment, was also a master swordsman, and he was on a level far above Kallian. When the two met, Kallian remarked that it had been quite some time. Duke? In that instant, Slyman was surprised. For a moment, it seemed as if he would immediately discover that the prince was also a master swordsman, but all he asked was how the prince had grown so much. He said Kallian was much taller now and truly looked like an adult. He also remarked that he had changed quite a bit, and for the better. Kallian replied that yes, he had improved just a little, but Slyman immediately denied it, saying it was far more than just a little. He then began guiding him through the castle while remarking that the wretched mage had truly found himself an excellent disciple. After all, to think that the 6th sword of the continent would be capable of using magic was simply absurd. Kallian then asked if he had already recognized him as a master swordsman. Slyman replied that he simply had not wanted to cause a commotion in front of everyone. He said he knew full well that Kallian still could not perceive his own aura, but that he could clearly see Kallian's. He then asked whether he had already reached that level, and said the mage must be extremely pleased. But Kallian replied that the one who was suffering was Yan, being dragged through Ellen's training. At that, Slyman laughed and said they should make Yan suffer even more. When night fell, Slyman apologized to the prince, but explained that he would need to step out for an important engagement. He had to carry out the routine inspection of the western area. Kallian replied that there was no problem at all. After all, they had arrived earlier than planned. Slyman then asked if he would be departing again the next day, and asked him to take care of himself. He also said that when he returned, they would have many things to talk about. Meanwhile, Ellen was drinking a glass of wine beside the king. He remarked that he had not imagined His Majesty would ask for alcohol right from the start. He then informed him that Prince Kallian had arrived safely in Elephant Territory. He then asked whether the king was relieved, or whether there were still other concerns. He also wanted to know why he was drinking so much. The king replied that he was concerned about the moment the fire of Camelon would be lit. Ellen asked if he was speaking of the succession. The king confirmed it. He said that as soon as Kallian returned from Rosalita, the 3 princes would finally be considered adults. That meant the moment to decide who would become crown prince was drawing ever closer. According to him, Randell seemed overly cautious, but it was impossible to know what truly went through his mind. Planche was the strongest, but was following the wrong path, and Kallian was still growing. All of that worried him greatly. Ellen replied that the solution was extremely simple. Just choose as heir whichever son he liked least, and all problems would disappear. The king did not even bother responding to that nonsense. Even so, Ellen continued, saying that Randell would probably behave himself until Kallian left that place. Only afterward would it be revealed whether His Majesty could truly see through him. But until then, Romain himself should not reveal his own thoughts. Worries could never be allowed to dominate a king. Regardless of who ended up lighting the flame, all of them would prove themselves in that moment. Meanwhile, Kallian finally arrived at the nest of Sisphania. He walked through an enormous dark cavern for a long time, unable to see the end of the place. He continued walking for several minutes until he finally reached a gigantic garden hidden deep within the cavern. But the instant he sensed the presence that dwelled there, he was completely struck with awe. The amount of mana was staggering. The power before him was terrifying. Kallian immediately dropped to his knees in respect, and he greeted the great Sisphania. Sisphania herself, the first queen, appeared before them. The moment he entered the nest, a gigantic pillar of light cut across the sky, so enormous and bright that it could be seen from very far away. While everyone observed in shock, Kallian greeted the great Sisphania, but could not conceal his confusion. He had always believed he would see only a manifestation of her will, not the first queen in her true form. Suddenly, all the weight of mana disappeared from his body. Sisphania then asked why a child who should not even exist in this world was searching for her. As she observed him, she noticed he carried memories from entirely different realities, and soon questioned why he had forgotten the blessing left within the sword. After that, she approached slowly, drawing so close she nearly touched him, and explained that she had called him precisely because of that. Outside, everyone who had accompanied the 3rd prince there was startled by the enormous pillar of light. No one understood what was happening. Yan was especially shaken, and then his own father remarked that his son's expression was interesting, asking if he was so worried about that child. Confused, Yan asked how that made any sense, since his father should be on the expedition. He had left the previous night, so he could not understand how he was already back. The man simply replied that he had returned. The shock grew even greater when they realized Yan was calling Slayman his father, and moreover, he had not returned alone. He was accompanied by Veronica Manasil, Ellen's granddaughter, and also by Rachel Grace, his daughter-in-law. Meanwhile, inside, Sisfania continued to draw closer to Callian, asking him to let her enter his memories. When she touched his face, she was able to see everything: Baron's past life, the war, the time axis, his return, and all the events that had followed. She then said something completely incomprehensible. His mind simply could not process those words. Noticing this, she asked whether he had truly been unable to hear. She then explained that perhaps he was not yet permitted to understand. Confused, Callian asked if she meant Sorrente. The queen then confirmed it. She said that if that was what he called her, then yes, she was speaking of the supreme goddess Sorrente, the one who had sealed the evil god during the war between the two deities. The prince replied that he had heard Sorrente had fallen into a deep slumber after performing the seal, but Sisfania explained that being asleep did not mean her existence had vanished. After all, even she herself had left her will behind and was still present. She then remarked that he probably still had many questions. And he truly did. Callian wanted to understand the time axis in Baron Secretia. Sisfania replied that she knew of it. He then asked why Caris desired the time axis so greatly. Once again, her answer could not be comprehended by him. The words simply made no sense in his mind. Sisfania then explained that Sorrente was not doing that out of malice. The goddess wanted him to discover everything in his own time, at his own pace. According to her, revealing too early the truth surrounding his death could end up disrupting important events of the future. Upon hearing that, Callian asked whether the event was so significant that even Sorrente herself was preventing him from learning the full truth. And Sisfania confirmed that yes, it was precisely that. In that moment, he realized the situation was far greater than he had imagined. If a goddess was directly interfering, then there was something enormous hidden behind it all. Shortly after, he began to think about Chase, and wondered if his brother had done something else. He then asked directly whether it had truly been Chase who had used the time axis, but Sisfania's answer was simple. Before being his brother, Chase was a king, and a king would not be foolish enough to disregard logic merely to prioritize his own family. That made Callian realize that perhaps it had not been his brother who used the time axis after all. Sisfania then turned her gaze back to him with curiosity, wishing to know exactly what he carried with him. When he handed over the stone, she once again said something impossible to understand. She then asked him to keep it. She said he would discover the truth when the right time came, and that he need not be disappointed for not having heard the answer he wanted yet. When he was ready, he would understand everything. Meanwhile, numerous carrier pigeons began to fly across Siegfried, rapidly spreading the news. After all, Callian had entered the nest of Sisfania, and a gigantic pillar of light had appeared in the sky, so bright it could be seen from outside the castle walls. Upon seeing that staggering number of pigeons, Slayman remarked that he had never seen so many in his territory. He then asked his daughter if she agreed. The one who approached at that moment was Demiria Siegfried, the family's heir. She replied that everything would be fine if people simply admired the pigeons, but reminded him that there were always those who envy the powerful. She also remarked that the owners of those pigeons would certainly try to uncover information about the family, so she believed it would be necessary to find out which servants of the great houses were present and keep them under watch. Upon hearing that, Slayman let out an amused sigh and remarked that he had truly married well, since both she and Yan were far too clever. Even so, he explained that if the family began to act with excessive caution, that could end up becoming something political. After all, they were people who protected, not people who governed. The reason they strengthened their own power was solely to continue being a shield. But Demira replied that she understood that. Even so, she believed the current situation was different, especially now that Callian was there. In the end, Slayman partially agreed. He said he would look into which servants were living in the territory and take some precautions, without turning it into excessive surveillance. He then tried to reassure her, telling her not to worry so much. He also mentioned that her brother was there, and asked why she did not spend some time with him. Shortly after, Yan appeared also, remarking on the staggering number of pigeons. Slayman then replied enthusiastically, pointing to the sky as if it were the most impressive thing in the world. Seeing the two of them acting that way, Demiria simply thought that they were two idiots. Meanwhile, the third prince remained still, reflecting on everything he had heard from Sisfania's own lips. The only thing he could think was when exactly the right moment would come for him to discover the full truth. Sometime later, Yan came to serve him tea and remarked that the prince had been standing at the window for a very long time. He said he was worried. He then asked if Callian was also watching the pigeons, but the prince only responded with a question of his own, asking if there was someone in the garden. When Yan looked outside, he noticed Hina was petting the dog named Yan. Yes, a poodle that had exactly the same name as him. Unable to believe it, he asked what kind of father would give a dog the same name he had given his own son. The prince then calmly replied that the two resembled each other quite a bit. Even so, both of them ended up noticing something else. Hina seemed to genuinely love animals in general. At that moment, Hina had just tried to use sign language with the dog, but naturally, the animal did not understand anything at all. Watching that, Yan remarked that if they truly wanted to give her a dog, they would have to teach it sign language as well. But Callian grew curious and asked how Yan was so proficient in sign language. Yan replied that he had a sick brother. It happened long ago, so he could already talk about it without any trouble. He then tried to lighten the mood by saying that besides that, now he had the prince there with him too. He then asked if Callian was genuinely thinking of getting a dog. After all, the other princes probably would not be very pleased with the idea. The prince prince calmly replied that in that case, he would go to Camelon, but Yan reminded him that Camelon was a palace reserved exclusively for crowned princes. He then began laughing to himself upon realizing the situation and remarked that Callian was probably the only person in the world who wanted to become a crowned prince just to be able to keep a dog. The prince then replied that he was also probably the only prince to have seen Sisphania's true form. For a few seconds, Yan simply froze. His mind took time to process what he had just heard, and all he managed to do was stutter in complete shock. Meanwhile, Queen Celeste received confirmation that the letter had been safely delivered. She was extremely anxious waiting for a reply. After some time, Callian finally contacted Ellen to share what the master had most been wanting to hear, and to do so, he went precisely to a place where Sisphania's influence did not reach within Siegfried. Not understanding at all, Ellen remarked that he had not even known such a place existed. Callian then replied, somewhat awkwardly, that he was in the cemetery. Before anything else, Ellen asked if his dear Rosalita had gone well. The prince replied that it had, and said there was a long story to tell. When Ellen heard everything that had happened, he was left in complete disbelief. He asked how it was possible that Callian had seen Sisphania's true form. He then complained that if he had known something of that magnitude would happen, he would have accompanied the prince without a second thought. Callian himself admitted he had also been surprised. He then shared what she had said. According to Sisphania, he would meet her again when he was ready, or perhaps when the right moment arrived. Even though he was frustrated to have missed it, Ellen said he unfortunately still had a great deal of work to do. After that, Callian asked how Celeste had reacted to Renon's disappearance. Ellen replied that she obviously found the whole thing very suspicious, since it had now been 10 days and they had found no sign of him. Furthermore, Evan Brisson had visited the palace that very morning. The prince then asked what the chances were of them revealing the truth, but Ellen explained that even if he wanted to, he could not. He had made a seal of oath. Upon hearing that, Callian remarked that he had not needed to go that far, but Ellen replied that even the prince's own disciple had made a seal of oath with the queen before becoming a master. He then admitted he also did not have much moral authority to speak on the matter. Even so, he assured the prince there was nothing to worry about. But Callian understood the situation perfectly. Renan was merely in charge of the dirty work. The true mastermind had always been Celeste, so it was obvious she would look for someone else to fill that role. It was then that Elam mentioned he had a very interesting letter in his hands. According to him, it had left Romain quite unsettled. Callian immediately asked if it was a letter from Margrave Brisson. Ellen confirmed it. He said he believed Celeste had summoned the man as soon as she noticed Renan's disappearance. He then explained that Grey Brisson was the eldest son of Marquis Evan Brisson, as well as the Margrave responsible for a territory near Tensel and one of the 6 master swordsmen of the continent. Continuing his explanation, Ellen revealed that the content of the letter was a request to send someone who could temporarily manage the territory, as Grey Brisson had been injured in battle against savage tribes, but to him, that was clearly just an excuse to turn Grey into Celeste's new operative. After hearing everything, Callian thanked him for the information and remarked that meeting another master swordsman seemed interesting. Later, he went to speak with Slayman. The two ended up sitting on an extremely simple and rustic bench, nothing more than an enormous log. During the conversation, Callian mentioned that he had personally met Sisphania during the ritual and had even seen her true form. He then said that perhaps they would not believe him, but before he could even finish, Slayman nearly burst with excitement. He said he knew. They had always known she was still alive. For years, many people had criticized the family for protecting the empty nest of an ancestral dragon that might no longer even exist. But in the end, they had been right all along. All their perseverance had not been in vain. After that, the prince remarked that he believed he would meet Sisphania again soon. Because of that, he wanted to create a magic teleport connecting Karis to Siegfried. Slyman replied that he understood the importance of his opinion, but asked whether he truly believed His Majesty would permit such a thing. After all, there was the possibility it would increase Karis's exposure to external invasions. Callian then explained he was thinking of connecting the teleport to his estate in Wittling, near the capital. In addition, he intended to establish another point about 1 day's distance from Siegfried's outer castle. He also made it clear that access would be extremely limited, and only authorized individuals would be able to use the portal, and if it ever became a security risk, they could simply destroy it. Sleeman replied that if His Majesty permitted it, the 1 day distance would pose no problem for them. After all, it was his request. But Callian then said he had one more request. Slyman immediately asked if he wanted a duel. The prince replied it was something along those lines, just a little different. He then produced a beautiful crystal formed from magic and aura. Slayman was surprised to realize Callian had made it without using a mediator. His surprise grew further when he saw the prince transform the orb directly into a sword. Callian explained that he wanted to make that weapon his new blade. Slyman then asked if he wanted to test its strength. Without waiting long, he drew his own sword and told him to come. After all, Slyman von Siegfried was the second strongest master swordsman of the entire continent. From the very first blow, the ground of the training field cracked completely. As he fought, Callian immediately realized how monstrously powerful the man was. The Duke's sword was heavy, just like its owner, yet at the same time incredibly fast. His movements had no openings whatsoever. Every blow was precise. The prince barely managed to escape the last attack, but even so attempted a counter at the very last instant. At that moment, Slayman noticed something remarkable. Even if only for a split second, the prince had managed to exploit a gap. He also noticed something else. Callian's sword did not possess possess much brute force, but it was staggeringly fast. The duel continued intensely. Though he lacked in physical strength, Callian possessed an extremely refined technique, and what was most frightening was that Slayman was not holding back for even a second. The fight remained balanced for quite some time. As they exchanged blows, Slayman began to think that the boy was far too talented. He also wondered exactly when he had become this way. Even so, he still believed the prince was no match for him. At this rate, he would soon discover the true limit of the boy's power. He then released his aura. Sensing it, Callian also summoned his own aura. Slayman's first blow pressed the prince so hard that he was forced to fall back immediately. Even so, he managed to retaliate using his radiant and incredibly swift sword. The attack was fast enough to cut Slayman's neck, drawing blood for the first time. But shortly after, the master amplified his aura further and responded with a monstrous blow that sent the prince crashing to the ground. Even while blocking the attack, Callian could not contain the full force. His radiant sword ended up shattering. However, Slayman's sword also became cracked. At the end of the duel, Slayman remarked that the moment the prince had wielded that sword, he had also perceived something important. But before he could finish the sentence, the door of the training field simply fell over. The reason was simple. Yoren and several soldiers had been trying to eavesdrop on the training from outside. When they came in, Yoren immediately saw Slayman's cracked sword and also the blood running down his neck. Stunned beyond belief, they asked if the master had lost. Later, after all that commotion had passed, Slayman appeared playing the violin with a surprisingly delicate touch. And frankly, no one would have imagined a brute of that size could play the violin that way. When the performance ended, Callian replied that he was surprised. He had not imagined Slayman would be talented with both the sword and the violin. He said it was a shame to be the only one listening to the performance at that moment. Was it not? Slayman replied that if someone was a Siegfried, even without being able to wield a sword, they could still play the violin, and he assured him it would be an honor to play at the banquet as well. At that moment, Callian noticed Slayman had a bandage on his neck and asked if the wound had hindered his performance. He replied that his skill would not rust from a mere little scratch. He said what had truly been hurt were his feelings, especially since Jan had seemed far more concerned about the prince than about him. Even so, Callian thanked him for the training. Now he understood how long his sword could last, and realized that against a power exceeding a certain threshold, it simply could not hold. When Slayman had released his aura earlier, the sword had been unable to sustain that power, and his future depended precisely on overcoming that. Duke Siegfried remarked that when the sword vanished, a shard ended up grazing his cheek. Was that right? He then asked if Callian was alright. He replied that he was not even bothered. He was fine. However, the Duke continued by saying that subconsciously, he had perceived something strange and ended up using too much power. He also explained that the swift way he wielded the sword was unusual. When he cut with it, or after a sequence of blows, he did not place weight in the waist. It was a very subtle habit, but still noticeable, and that was a trait typical of Baron Secreech's knights. Callian remained silent, clearly uneasy. The Duke then remarked that it was a strange habit for someone who had learned swordsmanship in Kairos, was it not? Kairos swordsmanship placed weight in the legs. In the earlier situation, for instance, the balance should have come from the thighs. Furthermore, when making transverse cuts, he had the strong habit of placing his weight in the waist as he turned, rather than in his legs. He said Callian needed to be careful, because while other people might not notice, Margrave Grey Brisson would pick up on it immediately. Callian then asked if Slayman would not question him about it. Slayman von Siegfried replied that it would change nothing even if the leader of the elephants discovered what lay beneath the third prince's skin. He then simply asked that they duel again later. Was that alright? Callian thanked him, but asked whether the Margrave would truly be able to perceive his aura. Slayman then explained that when Margrave Grey had chosen to follow the path of the sword, there were rumors that Evan Brisson had not been pleased with it, and had ended up giving him the Margrave title. But there were also rumors that Grey was even better than his own father. Because of that, there was a strong chance he could truly perceive his aura. It would be better for his highness to prepare. Callian replied he would take that advice. 10 days later, Ellen remarked that Arsene Siegfried must truly be remarkable, because the prince simply refused to leave. Callian replied that his preparations were taking longer than expected, but as soon as he finished checking everything, he would depart. He then asked if Margrave Brisson had already headed to the capital. Ellen replied that he had not yet. He also said that although they had tried to delay the procurator's arrival in the territory as long as possible, 15 days had been their limit. Callian thanked him for that, saying it was already enough. He would use that time to prepare. As he walked through the corridors, he thought that he was a mage, and also a swordsman who was not publicly known as such. If Evan and Grey perceived his aura that way, they would become even more alert. Because of that, the following day he went to Arkan and asked how he could conceal his mana. Arkan replied that of course there was a method for that. Since he had 4 circles, he could certainly hide his mana. He also explained that both circles and aura drew from mana as their source. Thanks to Ellen's guidance, they also began researching the construction of magic teleports. Rachel and Veronica helped considerably in that area. Ellen then remarked that his daughter-in-law was truly a gifted mage. She had been researching magic teleports for quite some time, and it had been precisely she who had reduced Duke Siegfried's investigation time. She would certainly be of great help. And so, little by little, they built that project together. Arkson, Veronica, and Rachel worked on the research while Arkson taught him how to conceal his mana. The magic itself was not so difficult for him. The real problem was managing to retain the mana, and since only Slayman could confirm whether the energy of the aura was still showing or not, he was unable unable to leave Siegfried's castle during that period. After many repetitions between the teleport research and the aura training, he finally managed to conceal it completely, and Slayman was astonished. He said he could see absolutely nothing. Now Callian appeared to be merely a well-behaved prince who had never touched a sword before. In the end, Callian managed to prepare everything he had wanted. He then prepared to leave elephant territory. Before departing, he said he would return stronger. "Do you hear, Slayman?" And so he resumed his journey back to the capital. Meanwhile, Gray was receiving reports from the procurator. After hearing everything, he asked if that was all. He remarked that interesting things had happened during his absence, and asked whether he should head to the capital soon. At the same time, Ellen, upon entering the prince's personal vault, remarked that it never ceased to amaze him. There was the money that arrived every month from Karis's largest wheat field, from the territory of Whitling, and also from Apolloni's profits. He then informed Marilyn that the prince would never run out of money. She asked if he had finished everything he needed to do, and if he was going to lock the room again. He replied yes, and thanked her for the good work, Marilyn. But before he could go down the stairs, he ended up running into Prince Planchy. What a coincidence. He remarked that it had been quite some time, had it not? Planche then asked if that boy had changed after meeting him, or if he had already changed before. He then said that Karis would not say anything, so he asked if the mage knew the truth. Ellen asked whether he had so many thoughts because he had stopped drinking, or whether he had stopped drinking precisely because he had too many thoughts. Plancha asked if that bothered him. Ellen simply replied that everyone changes, Prince Plancha, whether by stopping drinking or by losing fear of one's brother's reckless actions. Everyone changes. Simply that. Time passed, and it had already been 20 days since Callian had left Siegfried's territory. At that moment, they were stopped at Raddington, gazing at the region's beautiful lake. Callian thought it was a shame they could spend so little time in such a beautiful place. The only reason they had managed that pause was because Veronica's horse had fallen into a hole along the road, which ended up delaying the journey. Shortly after, Yan appeared carrying a tray and remarked that Viscount Raddington suited that place quite well. He was known as someone serious and attentive. Since they would soon be arriving in Karis, Yan said to take this as a brief rest. Callian agreed, saying they probably would not have another opportunity to relax like that, because everything would become quite hectic once they returned. But their peace ended quickly, when an exceedingly lavish carriage appeared. Upon seeing it, Callian told Yan to send a message on his behalf. Yan asked the Viscount whether he would truly reveal that the prince was staying there. Tessed Raddington was clearly nervous, thinking that even someone as removed from high society as himself knew very well that Prince Callian and the Brissons had a terrible relationship. He therefore suggested it might be better to turn them away, since they had been the first guests. Yan replied he would do that if it were any other member of the Brissons. However, since this was specifically Margrave Brissons, then Callian should meet with him. At that moment, Tessed realized it was indeed the Margrave himself and remarked, already relieved, that the prince had saved him from that complicated situation. Later, everyone was gathered in the same room. Tessed Raddington, Callian, and Margrave Grey Brisson. Grey did not even stand up to receive the prince. He said perhaps his highness was unaware, but he was injured and therefore could not demonstrate the appropriate etiquette by standing. Tessed was extremely nervous about that. Callian, for his part, knew very well that only one noble was authorized to greet a prince while remaining seated or mounted on a horse. Duke Slayman von Siegfried, and this was definitely not that man. Grey insisted that his injury hurt too much for him to stand. Callian then coldly replied that he should at least lower his head. Outside, listening through the door, Yan began to grow worried. He wondered why Callian was being so aggressive, and if the Margrave lost his temper and reacted violently, should he call Mr. Hertz? At that instant, Arkson appeared asking what Yan was doing standing at that door. Yan replied that he had come at a good time, because he would probably need his help and someone else's. Arkson remarked that he was still thinking about some ideas related to the teleport, but asked why they would be needed right now. Before Yan could even explain, they saw Hina running down the corridor in tears. Yan asked what had happened. Hina replied that her brother was having trouble with the knights. Arkson immediately said he would go check on it personally, but Yan warned him not to hurt anyone just yet. Arkson replied that he knew. Even so, Yan had a very bad feeling about it. It seemed like only a matter of time before things exploded on both sides. Meanwhile, inside, Grey asked if he had heard correctly. Had the prince truly ordered him to lower his head? Callian replied yes, and also said it was quite rude to ask a prince to repeat himself. It should not be his mouth moving, only his head. In that moment, Callian even released his killing intent to force Grey to lower his head. From the information he had received from Yan, since that body was not originally his, and many memories were still vague, Callian already knew Grey personally. Precisely because of that, the Margrave had never imagined the third prince would act in such a manner. Even Grey had received a letter from Celisay warning him not to see the third prince the same way as before. Callian then grew curious to see what decision Grey would make. Would he respond by also releasing his killing intent, or simply lower his head? Either choice would be the worst possible one. Grey had thought the queen was out of her mind, but now he could clearly see that the prince truly seemed like a different person. Even so, he still could not accept it. Before the situation deteriorated further, Tess had interrupted the tension by saying that since the Margrave had managed to stand up, he might as well show respect to the prince. The Viscount was clearly trembling with nerves, and Callian noticed he had needed to summon a great deal of courage to say that. Internally, Grey cursed the Viscount, calling him a useless wretch. Even so, he ended up kneeling and bowing before the prince. prince. He then declared that he, Grey Brisen, paid his respects to the great third prince of Karis. Callian only replied that all of this was an exhausting waste of time. He then told Tessid he would go up first and ask him to take good care of the Margrave. After all, he seemed to be in a great deal of pain. Just look at his face. Grey was indignant and asked how the prince dared speak in such a way. But at that instant, an enormous flash of light erupted from outside, completely flooding the window. Callian recognized that magic immediately. It was Arsen's work. He normally used ice magic, so a gigantic explosion of fire like that could only mean Arsen was calling for the prince on purpose. Outside, after destroying a carriage with a fireball, Arsen remarked to Kiri that he did not know exactly what had happened, but the prince would certainly not be pleased. Kiri replied that he knew that very well. The knights, furious, asked if he had any idea whose carriage that belonged to. Arken then asked if they knew who they had just provoked. One of the knights replied that they were probably just the third prince's lackeys. Arken calmly confirmed that yes, they were exactly that, but then he asked if he too was merely the son of the Marquis's little dog. The knight grew furious, but at that moment Callian appeared and said that what his lackey meant was precisely that. He was just the son of the Marquis's little dog. The knights immediately bowed before the prince. Callian then asked if he needed to compensate for the destroyed carriage. Arken replied that it was unnecessary, since they could simply deduct it from his salary. Even so, Callian asked what exactly was happening, since all of his people were gathered there. He then noticed something strange, and asked where Hina was. She always followed her brother everywhere, so why was Kiri alone? Arsen replied that he had initially not even known she was one of the prince's servants. He then explained that the knights had made remarks about a pretty mute girl that the Margrave would like to have. Callian simply asked if that was it then. He then, enraged, questioned where all these wretches kept coming from, and what kind of miserable cesspit this was. When Grey finally came outside, he found all of his knights with their tongues cut out. The prince himself had done that personally. Arsen then asked if those were not Grey's knights. After all, they had greatly irritated the prince by harassing one of his servants. He wanted to know if the Margrave was aware of that. Grey, internally, could only curse those idiots. And worst of all, several nobles were witnessing the entire scene, including Tessid himself, lord of that territory. Callian also informed Grey that the carriage Mr. Hertz had accidentally exploded would be paid for by Mr. Ellen Manasil once they arrived in Kairos. Grey was indignant and asked how that boy dared act that way. Callian then looked at Kiri and asked if he had anything to say. Kiri stayed silent for a few seconds. In his mind, this was nothing new. He had been through that kind of racism and elitism countless times. It was the kind of thing he always endured in silence, simply waiting to hold on a little longer until it passed. That was precisely why he had let the knights beat him. He wanted to stop his sister from suffering in his place, and also prevent the prince from having to intervene. In the end, he simply replied that no, your highness. He had nothing more to say. After that, Callian simply withdrew. Later, over tea with Tessid, he remarked that now that things had finally calmed down, the tea tasted even better. Tessid asked if his highness was truly alright, because the Margrave had left there extremely angry. He was worried that Grey might end up doing something against the prince. After all, he was a master swordsman. When he first encountered Grey, Callian had clearly sensed the powerful aura he emitted, but that also meant something else. If he could sense Grey's aura in that way, then Grey's level was equal to or lower than his own. In other words, Callian had a real chance of winning. He therefore replied calmly that everything was fine. Tessid found that fascinating. He could not detect any sign of anxiety on the prince's face. Callian appeared genuinely calm and confident. Even so, there was still something that bothered him. He then asked whether the prince would continue letting that servant of his act that way. Outside, Kiri was running laps around the estate without stopping. Tessid remarked that he had been running for hours. Callian replied that it was no problem, since he wanted to teach Kiri something important, and to learn, he would have to make a genuine effort. He also made it clear that he could not rely on someone who could not even endure that much. The two had different problems to face, and it was time for Kiri to understand that. Tessid then realized this was not a simple punishment, especially seeing that the mage responsible for destroying the carriage was resting calmly in the meantime. It was clear to him that Callian was not punishing the boy. In reality, the trust between the prince and his servant was so strong it almost made Tessid envious. Shortly after, Callian remarked to the Viscount that he had heard the Margrave had asked to borrow a carriage. He then asked what would happen if, by chance, the wheels of the territory's carriages happened to also be broken, and they simply could not lend any. At once, Tessid realized the prince had understood the whole excuse from the beginning. He knew perfectly well that the Viscount did not want the Margrave in his territory. Tessid then replied that if the lord of a small territory like his were to lend a carriage without thinking about the consequences, he would end up with no way to get around. Callian then remarked that he had heard Tessid's family was in Karis. Though that territory was peaceful and wonderful for raising a family, he asked if he did not miss them. Tessid found the question strange and wanted to know its purpose. Callian then handed him a letter sealed with his own emblem and explained that using it, Tessid could request an audience with him whenever he wished. He also suggested they could travel to the capital together. Tessid accepted the letter and replied that as soon as the horses of the group had recovered, the carriage men would be ready to depart. Meanwhile, Soleil was having tea with her beloved son Planche. She remarked that Callian would be returning soon, and that he was spreading remarkable rumors wherever he went. She even said that Planche would probably be happy to hear all of it. But this was the first conversation she had had with her son in 5 months, and the only thing she talked about was Callian. Planche then asked if she had summoned him there because she missed his brother. Celeste completely ignored the question and said that the Margrave would also be arriving soon. She remarked that she did not know exactly what Grey was so pleased about, but that this was a path Planche would inevitably have to walk one day. Planche replied that he hated that word. Eventually, he also said he had no idea who had decided that path for him. The queen then asked why he was behaving so childishly. Even if he complained like that, his fate would not change. She then repeated once more that the Margrave would be arriving soon. Planche then remarked that on that day, he simply should have stayed quiet. One person had changed completely, while the other remained exactly the same. Soleil replied coldly that he need not bother. Planche then said that yes, they certainly still had a great deal of work ahead of them, so he would stay very quiet, exactly as he should have done last time. During the journey back, Callian contacted Ellen, using the communication ring. He informed him that, despite the delay, they would arrive at Raddington within the following week. Ellen replied that was excellent, because they might be able to prevent Baron Melfer Paloon from literally dying of overwork. According to him, the subordinates were suffering quite a bit. Callian then asked whether the rumors about the accident had already spread, and also wanted to know what his father had said about the entire situation. Ellen replied that the king had decided to accelerate the creation of Valken. He then recalled an earlier conversation and told the prince everything. According to Roman, after the incident in Siegfried's territory, all expectations had shifted toward that child. That alone would be enough to make the Brezens nervous. And now, after the humiliation suffered by the Margrave, the situation could become even more dangerous. For that reason, the king had decided to hand over to Valken the constructions and grounds previously used by Pabel's Knight Cavalry inside the palace. Ellen remarked that was practically a declaration of war against the Brezens. Romain replied yes, but if that served to divert their gaze away from Callian, it would not be a bad choice. Even so, the prince grew concerned and replied that this would put his majesty in danger. Ellen said the king had already taken that into consideration and announced that the formation would take place as soon as Callian returned. The inauguration ceremony would be held the following week, but Callian knew the situation was not so simple. Even with the master by the king's side, Kayla, who protected Romain, still needed to complete the path of the sword. If Grey arrived in Karis in that state, Romain's life could truly be in danger. It was then that Callian asked Yan if this was the only possible route to Karis. Yan replied yes, provided they made no detours. At once, Callian felt an overwhelming urge to cause another commotion. He simply did not want to let the Margrave reach the capital so easily. Meanwhile, Grey was already traveling in a carriage far too small for his size, demanding they go faster, for the love of God. But shortly after, the coachman announced that someone was following the carriage. When Grey stuck his head out, he realized it was the prince himself, mounted on Raven. Immediately, Grey wondered how the prince had managed to catch up with them so quickly. In his mind, that could only be some trick learned from that mage. And the prince simply replied that Grey had still not corrected his old habit of not greeting royalty. The man grew irritated at once and said he would teach that boy a lesson, that he would end the boy's lowly lineage right then and there. But before he could do anything, Callian released an enormous explosion from his mana blade. The impact was so powerful that everyone around was left in shock. He then seized Grey by the neck and said coldly that it was Grey who had first shown hostility. He had also insulted a prince, so this was nothing but self-defense. Shortly after, Callian began to slash the man's body without any hesitation, asking how he dared insult his lineage in such a manner. Already fallen on the ground, completely bloodied, Grey began to beg for forgiveness, saying he had made a mistake. Even so, Callian continued speaking calmly and asked whether he had never been curious about the disappearance of his own younger brother. He then revealed that someone had paid the Marquis Bresson a great deal of money to deal with Raynon, and that was how he had disappeared. But he did not stop there. Callian remarked that he was also curious about whether the Marquis would accept money to get rid of the family's firstborn son, the very one who held the title. After that, he ordered Grey to answer carefully and asked who had beaten him so badly like that. Trembling with fear, the man replied that it had been Marquis Evan Brizon. Even upon hearing that, Callian stepped on the Margrave's body once more and remarked, in an almost ironic tone, that a father leaving his own son in such a state was truly cruel. He then asked the servants around them if they all agreed with that information. Without the courage to contradict him, all of them immediately replied yes, your highness. After that, they took the poor battered man and escorted him back to his own territory. When everything was over, Callian looked at Kiri and asked whether he had truly heard nothing. After all, he had watched the entire scene while holding the horse. Kiri only replied that blood had splattered onto his face. Your highness. He then tried to bring up the earlier subject, but Callian said it was alright. The simple fact that Kiri had followed him all the way there already showed that his thinking had changed. According to him, the old Kiri had understood certain things better. Confused, Kiri asked what that meant. Callian then simply told him to get ready, because he had something important to tell him, a story from 10 years ago. Since the road to their destination would still be long, there would be enough time to explain everything. When Prince Callian finally returned, he was received with applause. Shortly after, he joined his brothers for a meal. He apologized for the delay and, for the first time in a long while, greeted both brothers others in the appropriate manner. The reaction was so unexpected that the others did not even know how to respond, especially since even Planche had returned the greeting. The king himself sat with them and began by asking Randell if he had finished reading the editorial. The young man replied yes. Romain said he would hear his opinion later and turned his attention to Planche, remarking that he had heard he had been training swordsmanship quite intensely lately. He said his body looked stronger and suggested they go hunting together sometime. A hunting trip could be fun. As he observed all of this, Callian realized it had been a very long time since he last felt such a light atmosphere within that family. After all, the king had changed considerably compared to the past. Before, he used to be much colder toward his own sons, but the tranquil atmosphere did not last long. A subordinate approached the king and whispered something in his ear. After listening, Romain authorized the person's entry. At once, Callian noticed that Planche already appeared unsettled, and with good reason, because the one who walked into the hall was none other than Queen Celeste. Callian greeted her by saying it had been quite some time since they last met. She replied yes and remarked that he looked well. She also said she had been worried about the journey back, since it seemed tiring, but Callian replied calmly that he was in one piece and nothing had happened. In fact, he even said the journey had been comfortable, perhaps because he had managed to deal with a few threats along the way. Queen Celeste replied that that was a relief, and mentioned she had also heard about what had happened in Siegfried's lands, which had worried her further. According to her, the people's praise had already reached Assia Palace, and that was surprisingly pleasant to hear. Shortly after, however, she asked the king directly whether he was truly considering Callian as the next crown prince. The moment she asked that, the entire hall fell silent. Even the brothers seemed unable to believe she had said it so openly. In Callian's mind, she was so desperate she had already given up the pretense of the gentle act she usually performed. The king then replied calmly that some time ago, Lord Manasile had suggested sending whichever son he liked least to Camelon, since that way the problems would disappear on their own. He said that since they were all his sons, he had always been conflicted, but now, thanks to her excessive worrying, he was beginning to seriously consider making a decision. Queen Celeste replied that she did not know how long his arrogance would last, but that a day would come when he would regret treating her that way. After that, she left the hall, slamming the door behind her. As soon as she was gone, the king apologized for what had happened and said he had no intention of provoking it. Planche replied only that he understood. Romain then continued and said he was certain that everyone there knew what had become of their uncle. Therefore, he did not wish any of his sons to follow the same path or repeat the same mistake. Later, as he walked through the garden at night, Yan remarked to Callian that princes excluded from the succession normally had to leave Caris upon reaching the age of 20. Furthermore, they could not maintain personal guards and were restricted from remaining in the capital for more than 5 days. In compensation, they received their own territory to govern. Yan then explained that Callian's uncle, the king's brother Romain, named Aslan, was a different case. After Romain was chosen as crown prince, Aslan revolted against the decision and launched a rebellion. As one would expect, the uprising failed. Currently, he lived imprisoned in a tower built deep within Werika Canyon, to the south of Siegfried's lands. After hearing that, Callian concluded that the king probably wanted to prevent his own sons from ending up in a bloody war between siblings, where they might die or end up imprisoned in the same way. Instead, he wished them all to enjoy their time together and maintain a good relationship. Jan replied that perhaps it was presumptuous of him to think so, but he believed that was exactly it. But before they could continue the conversation, Callian noticed something strange emerging from among the garden bushes. A rose appeared slowly amid the leaves, shining with an intense light. What was strangest was that it emitted the same glow as the rune-covered stone he carried with him. The prince noticed it was far too strange. That was the only rose in the garden still standing upright. Furthermore, it was clearly resonating with the unknown stone he carried. The moment Callian touched the flower, it immediately turned to ash and dissolved into the air, carried by the wind far away from the palace. In that instant, the sensation was extremely strange. It felt as though time had been frozen for a very, very long time, and then, suddenly, had begun moving all at once again. It was in that moment that Callian began connecting all the dots. Time, the stone, the rose, the elf, the time axis, Sethphania, and then he recalled the words of Sorrente, who had told him to follow his own pace and take his own time. But Callian simply thought that obviously, he had no intention of being that patient. 2 days passed after that. During that time, Callian did not leave his room even once. He simply rested in silence and completely ignored any meeting or engagement he was supposed to attend. But in the middle of the night, someone interrupted his rest. The person entered through the balcony and remarked they were impressed he had sensed their presence so quickly. Without even properly getting up from the bed, Callian asked why that person had come in such a manner. It was none other than Planche. As he observed his brother, Callian thought it truly made sense to say Planche took after their mother quite a bit, especially when it came to freely entering places where he had clearly not been invited. Planche then remarked that the garden rose had disappeared and asked directly if that had been Callian's doing. At once, Callian raised a soundproofing barrier around the room and asked, in a provocative tone, if Planche valued that rose so much. After all, he had come all the way there in the middle of the night, and in such a rude manner just because of that. But Planche replied that he was certain Callian had noticed that was not merely an ordinary flower. He then asked if that was the reason he had not even appeared at breakfast. In Callian's mind, that only confirmed once more that Planche was far cleverer than he appeared. The second prince then explained that the rose had been cultivated by Randell. Since Randell carried the blood of Tensel, the land of priests, Planshaw had suspected it might be related to sacred powers. He himself had asked Randell countless times about the garden flower that never wilted, but every time Randell pretended not to know the reason. After hearing that, Callian asked what exactly Planche expected to hear, that he would simply admit something like, "Yes, it was me who put the flower there," but Planche replied that was a rude way of deflecting. He then explained that without the power of a priest, that rose could never have stayed alive for so long without wilting. Therefore, he could not understand why Randell was hiding the fact that he possessed priestly abilities. He then explained the true reason he had appeared there that night. He had told Randell that Callian had burned the rose, and after that, he had simply decided to leave things as they were. He also said that if Callian wanted to keep pretending he understood nothing, then he would leave. But before he could leave the room, Callian blocked his path and asked why he was doing this. After all, they did not have a close enough relationship for this kind of help, did they, brother? But Planche simply replied that he thought Callian had already noticed. No matter how strong Callian became, he would never be able to defeat Randell, just as Planche himself could not either. Callian then asked if that meant Planche was helping now, because Randell had never been capable of standing up to Solace. In response, Planche simply smiled. Later, alone, Callian stayed reflecting on all of it. A flower that bloomed through the power of a priest. The black stone he carried, permeated with the scent of blood, reacting directly to that flower. Everything was clearly connected. But to discover exactly why the stone had reacted that way, he would need to act directly against Randell. He needed to find out both why Randell was able to make the flower bloom, and why he was hiding his own powers. And in the end, there was only one way to force Randell to act. He needed to strip Solace of the power she still held. The problem was that Callian knew very well he did not have that much time to make it happen. That very morning, in another part of the palace, Queen Solace asked the messenger irritably what had happened, and told her to repeat everything from the beginning. The maid explained that Grey Brisson had been gravely wounded along the road, and had returned to his own territory. That immediately made Solace suspicious, because she had been certain he was still near the capital before the information had simply stopped coming. She asked again whether it was truly the case that he had been wounded. The maid replied that when the Margrave had approached the capital, Marquis Evan Brisson had sent men to attack him. Not understanding anything, Solace asked if his own father had done that, and wanted to know why. The maid then explained that Marquis Evan had sent word that Grey was never to return to Caris again. Apparently, he had discovered that the Margrave was trying to seize the family's title for himself. Immediately, Solace began to wonder whether the father had discovered the secret arrangement she maintained with Grey. But that made no sense, since no one should have known about that contract. She asked again whether the father had personally gone after him, but the maid replied that he had not. Celeste then wanted to know who exactly had wounded the Margrave so severely. A master? A swordsman? But the maid replied they were still not certain. In the end, Solace ordered that medicine be sent immediately to Grey Brisson. Furthermore, she wanted to find out as quickly as possible whether he was truly that badly wounded, and above all, who had been responsible for leaving him in that state. She considered the possibility that Grey had truly been injured, but quickly realized it made no sense. She did not know who had done it, but she was certain the person had used their head. Someone was trying to pin the blame on her father. What was most ironic was that it had been precisely she who had suggested to Grey to use the injury as an excuse. That very afternoon, she was already bribing one of Pable's most loyal knights, Tael, the vice commander of the knights. Many people were fooled by his appearance, but behind it lay a cold-blooded assassin, someone who would kill anyone for a few gold coins. She ordered him to investigate whether the third prince's guard had encountered Grey Brisson during the events in Rosalita, and if he had, she wanted to know exactly what had happened between them. She also made it clear that if it became necessary to silence him, she would pay double. Upon hearing that, Tael asked double of what, and wanted to know who he was supposed to eliminate. She then replied that the target was Arsene Hertz, a mage. Meanwhile, several nobles began to gather for the king's announcement. The hall was filled with whispers and gossip about everything that had been happening, especially the rumors that Evan had attacked his own son. When the ceremony began, King Romain announced that he had something very important to reveal. For a long time, Caris had kept its distance from magic, placing all its trust solely in the strength of the sword. Because of that, the imperial family had decided to officially create a mage squadron. The news left everyone in shock. Caris had always had a troubled relationship with magic, and prejudice against mages in that place was practically normal. Even so, Romain continued the announcement and revealed that the new squadron would receive the name Valken. The opening ceremony would take place in 1 week. All preparations were already complete, and Valken would begin using the facilities that had previously belonged to Pable's knights. After the announcement, Romain decided to step back a little to avoid having complaints whispered in his ear. It was at that moment he encountered Callian, who asked if he would truly be alright. The king told him not to worry, but wanted to know why his son had requested a secret meeting. In truth, Callian wanted to ask about something important. He intended to begin meeting with the nobles of the knight families. Romain immediately understood what his son meant. The growth of Callian's power could end up threatening the king's authority. Rather than feeling bothered, Romain felt proud of his son's audacity. He said Callian could do as he wished, but warned that to accomplish it, he would need to avoid the eyes of the Brisson family. He also asked whether he had considered expanding the hunting excursion together with Planche. Later, Yan was excitedly celebrating the fact that the prince prince finally had his own power and, above all, a mage squadron. Kallian, however, reminded him that Valken was not yet officially linked to him. Even so, Yan replied that he could not hide his joy. It was then that Arsene appeared, looking like a genuine zombie from overwork. The poor mage was completely drained to exhaustion, barely standing upright. Even in that state, he reported that he had finally obtained an answer about the magic teleport. According to Arsene, through the principle of the Oath Seal, it would be possible to create mass contracts between the traveler and the magic circle. In other words, Kallian would be able to monopolize the magic teleport system. The prince praised his work and said they would discuss the details later. He also mentioned there would be a banquet, and told Arkan to rest for at least that day. The mage was genuinely grateful for the consideration, but explained that he still needed to meet Lord Manasil after the celebration. Just imagining what he would hear the next day if he showed up at home in that state already gave him a headache. Kallian then said he would handle that personally, and told Arsene to rest immediately. The mage was truly thankful and decided to follow the advice. Honestly, it seemed as though the only reason he had not collapsed right there was that a small shred of good sense still remained in him. Before leaving, Kallian also warned him not to fall asleep on the way, and that was exactly what happened. Later, inside the carriage, Arsene drifted off to sleep. However, he recalled the prince's warning and woke up just in time to notice a group pursuing his carriage. Without hesitation, he leapt outside and ordered the coachman to flee. He then raised an ice barrier to block the first enemy attack. He then finally introduced himself as Arsene Hertz, vice commander of Valken. Meanwhile, when the prince found Elon, the first thing Elon asked was where Mr. Hertz was. The prince replied that he was busy with work at the moment. News about Gray had probably already reached Salese, so she would certainly make a move. Elon immediately caught on and asked if they were using Arsene as bait. The prince confirmed that the queen was likely growing suspicious as to whether the Margrave was still on her side. After all, Gray had not come to help her out of brotherly love. The market title would only become available if Evan Breeson died, so the possibility of betrayal had certainly crossed Salese's mind. Ellen remarked that it would take him a little while to fully understand the entire situation. Even so, the prince was certain that Celeste was unaware of Arxen's true potential. His power had never been publicly revealed, so she had probably only sent a few middling knights to eliminate him. In the prince's view, that would not even be a real threat to Arxen. Ellen then admitted that after what he had witnessed in Rosalita, his confidence in Mr. Hertz had grown considerably. When asked whether that was a good thing, he replied yes. After all, Arsene had been the last person he had seen before coming to that life. And indeed, Arsene was handling the assassins with ease. Ice stakes pierced through soldiers in the blink of an eye. Everything was happening far too fast. Tail began to fall into shock. That mage was not supposed to be this powerful. Normally, mages needed time to select targets, memorize spells, and recite incantations, but Arsene was using multiple spells simultaneously without showing any difficulty at all. Even so, Tail tried to convince himself that he was still just a mage, someone weak in close combat. He then ordered everyone to advance at once. The knights closed in rapidly, but their attacks were blocked by magic barriers. Before they realized it, ice stakes were piercing through their bodies. In that moment, Tail realized he should never have accepted that mission. They had truly believed they could win with just 10 men. They were completely massacred. Desperate, Tail tried to flee, but the instant Arxen noticed, he simply teleported to right beside him. The mage calmly said that only he remained now. Seized by fear, Tail begged for mercy. He said he would reveal anything. He could tell Prince Kallian everything he knew. He admitted it had been the queen who had sent the group and swore he would testify against her if necessary. But Arsene replied that he was certain the prince no longer even cared about what had happened back then. Desperate to survive, Tail kept pouring out information. He asked if they knew who was behind Renan Breeson's disappearance. Arsene already suspected it was the prince himself. He then asked if they knew who had wounded the Margrave, and once again, Arsene already suspected the answer. Tail then revealed something that truly caught his attention. He disclosed that the Marquis maintained a gambling arena in Kyrus where people bet on human lives. Upon hearing that, Arsene remarked that there was someone beside the prince who understood such matters quite well, but Tail still had more information. He said that ever since the Marquis had chosen to follow the path of the sword, his weapon had been completely destroyed. Even so, he had been hiding that from the Margrave for a long time. Arsene immediately realized the prince would want to hear that information, but before Tail could say anything further, his head was severed from his body. Coldly, Arsene remarked that if someone is good at keeping secrets, then they should carry them to their grave. After that, he decided it was time to head back. However, he did not want to spend mana by using teleportation again. It was then that he heard horses approaching rapidly. Later, Kallian received a bag clearly far too heavy to contain anything ordinary. Inside it was a severed head, and at the same time, Evan ended up being accused of kidnapping Arxen Hertz.